From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I'm Peggy Bolger, Director of the American Folklife Center, for those of you who don't know me. And on behalf of the Librarian of Congress, Dr. James H. Billington, I want to welcome you to the Library of Congress. How many people is it their first time to the Library of Congress? Yay, Steve. Okay. All right. If you haven't been to the Great Hall, you need to take a little tour with one of our staff here at a certain break so that you can just see the library. A lot of people don't realize what a treasure it is physically as well as intellectually. So today I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to an event we've been planning for quite a while, the symposium titled Work and Transformation, Documenting Working Americans. The American Folklife Center has been focusing on the documentation of work going back to its founding in 1976. And that focus has really continued in one way or another up until this day. And we look at the topic of work as a theme, a topic, and a unique mode of cultural transmission. In particular, occupational folklore was a passion of Dr. Archie Green, the pioneering folklorist and cultural activist who helped to found the American Folklife Center by literally lobbying full-time for over 6 years in the early 1970s. He left a tenured position as a professor at the University of Illinois and came to Washington and walked the halls of Congress because he really believed in this. Archie was an inspiration and a mentor to many of us in the field. He was both a PhD folklorist as well as a card-carrying 67-year member of the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America, Local 2236. And so Archie came at this from both ends of the spectrum, and he was kind of a Renaissance man as far as occupational folklore is concerned. He called what he was doing and what he was studying labor lore, and many of us refer to it as the culture of the workplace or occupational folklore. But no matter how we categorize it, we're describing the act of documenting the experiences, the insights, and traditions of working Americans, so their voices can be added to our national historic record. Archie Green's work in occupational folklore was so significant, and his role in founding the center so important, that before he died, the Librarian of Congress awarded him the library's prestigious Living Legend Award. He joins Paul McCartney, Dolly Parton, many luminaries, too numerous to name. I think there's about 200 living legends, but Archie is there, and as he should be. It has now been about 2 years since Archie's death, and so we decided at the Folklife Center the best way to honor and remember him was by creating a fellowship in his name. And so with the support of Congress, the Archie Green Fellowships were established in 2009 to support new documentation on American workers. And in this first year, 3 fellowships were awarded to senior researchers in Idaho, Louisiana, and New York. And we're going to hear about the results of this fieldwork over the course of the next 2 days. The Fellows' documentation will become part of the American Folklife Center archive as the first installment of what we're calling the America Works collection. And we know that this collection will enrich the Library of Congress holdings and be an invaluable resource for future patrons and researchers. But this symposium also signals a long-term commitment on the part of the Folklife Center to continue the documentation of workplace culture. We hope to stimulate scholarship and investigate ways in which folklife fieldwork can address one of the most important challenges that's facing America and the world today. And that is, of course, the transformation of work and the profound changes taking place in the workplace. This transformation and the new skills that will be required to succeed in the 21st century workplace will be as significant as the changes that occurred during the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. At the urging of the Folklife Center's Board of Trustees, our staff has spent the last year seeking input and establishing partnerships that will help us develop broad documentation initiatives about work. Inspired by Archie Green, as well as important historic projects that are housed here at the library, for instance, we have all of the seminal WPA oral histories, our goal is to capture a portrait of the American workforce in transition. We're also establishing connections with local libraries, museums, and other cultural institutions that have similar interests in documenting working Americans and capturing their story. The center has found excellent partners, and we discovered that several sister organizations were on the same track. Early inquiries led us to discussions with the Institute of Museum and Library Services, as well as the American Folklore Society and the National Council for the Traditional Arts. And in particular, IMLS was a perfect fit for this initiative in that they've been rethinking the role that community-based libraries and museums will play as centers for teaching 21st century work skills to their own community members. And we're thrilled to have IMLS as the co-sponsor of this symposium, as well as a partner for the pilot documentation and educational initiative that we call America Works. So this project is still in the planning stages, but it's envisioned as a nationwide born digital documentation effort, almost like a digital federal writers project for the 21st century. It will involve the collection of oral histories about work and workers from everyday Americans across the country. Local libraries and museums, who are the partners with IMLS, will be, we hope, the venues to spearhead the collecting of these historically important narratives. They'll also facilitate the teaching and learning of documentary skills by their patrons and develop local public programming that are based on the resulting audio and visual interviews. All of this documentation then will, of course, come here to the Library of Congress and be available for scholars and the public in perpetuity. So this symposium kind of kicks us off. It brings together workers from many spheres. We have humanities scholars, cultural administrators, federal policymakers, bureaucrats, that's me, entertainers, media producers, and maritime masters, among others. And so solving the challenges of the new workplace will require that we all interact collaboratively and listen to the stories that inform our collective American culture. And our hope is that this gathering will help us all to think creatively about how to make our personal narratives and our documentary efforts relevant, effective, and of use to local communities and public policymakers. Before starting, I'd need to acknowledge the inspiration and guidance of the Board of Trustees for the Center in suggesting this focus on work, a new renewal of a focus on work, I should say, and especially our chair, Kurt Dewhurst, for his leadership. And I also want to thank our co-sponsor, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and its staff for their indispensable assistance in developing and presenting this program today, and especially Acting Director Marcia Semmel, who you'll hear from in a minute. And I also want to recognize the contributions of Betsy Peterson of the Fund for Folk Culture and Nancy Gross of the American Folklife Center and Nancy Rogers of IMLS staff, who collectively are producing the symposium and leading this team. And finally, I want to thank all of the speakers and the experts who've taken time from their busy schedules to prepare presentations for this event. As with all of our symposia, all of these sessions today and tomorrow are being recorded, you can see this here, both for our archive but also for posting on the library's website. So within a few weeks, people all over the world should be able to access this symposium online. And this also means that if you would, if you could turn off your cell phones now and your beepers, your pagers, whatever makes noise, we'll be very grateful for that. So again, I want to thank all of you for coming out today, and it's my pleasure now to introduce Marcia Semmel, Acting Director of the Institute for Museum and Library Services. Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you so much, Peggy. I was going to start with my thank yous, and you ended with them. So, of course, I want to thank everyone from Dr. Billington here at the Library of Congress and Deanna Markham for their support of this initiative throughout. And the team, I'm going to add Peggy to the team, the important leadership of the team that has not only worked on this symposium, but has been an invaluable member of our team in getting our partnership off the ground, the partnership with the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the wonderful thinking and support of Kurt Dewhurst and the other members of the American Folklife Center Board, my colleague Mary Chute, our Deputy for Libraries, who has been indispensable and is an important part of everything and anything we do with the Library of Congress, and Nancy Rogers and Abby Sweats from our Office of Strategic Partnerships. And Betsy and Nancy here, Nancy Gross and Betsy Peterson, you've done a great job. So for me, this symposium is the kickoff, as Peggy said, and what we hope will continue to be a long and useful and robust relationship that builds on the role that the American Folklife Center plays in this country and the role that IMLS plays in supporting some 123,000 libraries of all types in every community in this country, and what we know are at least 18,000 museums of all types in communities around the country. I say that because we are in the process of doing a census of museums in the United States, and our preliminary work has turned up a lot more than 18,000 museums of all types that populate our communities. Through these libraries and these museums, IMLS discharges our core mission, which is to build the capacity of museums and libraries of all kinds throughout the country in three principal ways: sustaining cultural heritage and knowledge, and that is through a variety of mechanisms, and conservation and digitization are two of the big ones, preservation, enhancing learning and innovation, and our new initiative on museums, libraries, and 21st century skills is key to this initiative and to this goal of recognizing and supporting the roles of libraries and museums as centers of lifelong learning. I like to say lifelong, life-wide, and life-deep learning, stealing a phrase from a recent study by the National Academies of Sciences. And then the third goal, which is getting stronger and stronger in our agency based on some wonderful funding that we've had, is to build the skills of library and museum professional and unpaid staff to keep up with the changing nature of the world around us, the changing demographics of the world around us, the needs of our audiences, and the changing goals of our communities, so that those three goals, sustaining culture, heritage, and knowledge, enhancing learning and innovation, and building the skills of our library and museum workforce, fit very neatly, it seems to me, in this partnership with the Library of Congress that we're calling America Works. So we have great hopes for the next phases of our partnership, the pilot project that Peggy just described, where we all hope to work together with libraries and museums around the country, folklorists, ethnographers, public historians, and other organizations to document this profound transformation of work in the 21st century. Libraries and museums in the current recession have been playing an important role, and especially libraries, in getting workers back into the workforce, in providing resume writing skills, in connecting workers to job banks. And one of the people you'll hear from in this symposium is Mary Boone, the state librarian of North Carolina, who has played a leadership role in her state, working with the department in her state, Department of Labor. And we at IMLS now have a special agreement with the Department of Labor that really fosters the role, especially of public libraries, in working with one-stop centers around the country to build skills and to get people engaged in and back into the workforce. So that is a very, very important goal that I see our American Works project continuing. The other thing, of course, that we do routinely is to document and preserve stories and objects and artifacts around the history of this country in so many different ways, in so many different institutions. And America Works will further that goal. And of course, the other things that we do through internships, mentorships, and other programs in our museums and libraries is we build the skill sets that our young people will need as they enter into the job market. Those 21st century skill sets of teamwork, collaboration, scientific literacy, and you'll hear from Jennifer Correa at the New York Hall of Science a little bit about the Science Career Ladder project that fosters this. So, I'm unfortunately not going to be here tomorrow because one of the things that we're doing with our Museums and Libraries and 21st Century Skills Initiative is we are going around to communities all over the country and bringing museum and library people together with foundation people, with educators, with social service organizations around what are the specific current learning needs in different communities. So the libraries and museums, again, they don't have the final word on all the challenges facing our communities around these days, but what we're trying to support is their leadership role in helping a community and leveraging the community's competencies, the resources, the expertise, and knowledge, and showing how libraries and museums working together with other organizations can help address pressing current community challenges around learning and around new skills. So I'm going to be sorry to miss tomorrow's session, but I want you to know that on Wednesday, Ray Santiago at the Miami-Dade Public Library and Kathy Leff at the Wolfsonian Museum will be gathering some 60 people in Miami representing all different cultures, all different issues around ways in which the libraries and museums can document, preserve, transform, and enrich and enhance the learning community of Miami-Dade County. So in sum, I want to congratulate the Archie Green Fellows. I think you are national treasures in yourselves, and I think we are thrilled that with your appointment and eager to learn more about your projects. I want to reiterate how proud IMLS is to be a partner with the Center for American Folklife in this particular program and as we move to the next stages of our partnership. And I want to thank in advance everyone in this room who I hope will help us think creatively and effectively about the nature of work today and in the past, the future of work, and the role of our cultural heritage institutions in capturing the human stories of work and in providing space, whether that space is in physical space or in a communal online space, for individuals, for families, and for communities to learn and to grow throughout their lifetimes. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm David Taylor, a folklorist and head of research at programs at the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress. It's my pleasure to introduce the symposium's first panel, featuring one of our 2010 Archie Green Fellows and also a person that he's worked with in the field. The Archie Green Fellow is Steve Zeitlin, who's the director of City Lore, a wonderful organization based in New York City. And the person he's worked with in the field is Steve Wonder, who's captain of the tugboat Seneca. And together, the two Steves are going to be talking to us about the project Heartland Passage, Work and Workers on New York State's Erie Canal. And I'm hoping there'll be time for a few questions after their presentation. So join me in welcoming Steve Zeitlin and Steve Wonder to the platform in their turn.
Hi. So have a seat. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the project and its inception first, and then I want to show you a few scenes from Steve Wonder and his partner on the tugboat Seneca, and then I'll Steve and I will just talk a little bit about, I'll just ask him some questions about his job and his work as well. This project for me got its start some years back when I was trying to figure out how to take my wife and two kids to Europe on a vacation, and came up with the same conclusion that I usually reached every year, and which is that we couldn't afford it, as always. And so we had heard that you could take a houseboat on the Erie Canal, and that for something like $400, you could rent a houseboat for a week, and you would drive the houseboat yourself. And we ended up doing that and taking this kind of very American family vacation. And on that tugboat, tugboat is like an RV on the water, is actually more like it. That's where I started to realize that the Erie Canal, to me, seemed to tell such a very powerful American story. Because when you travel to all the towns along the canals, like Albion, you realize that these were once, the riches of America. This was the industrialization of America that took place from 1825 when that canal opened. And it really spurred the Industrial Revolution, and it made New York City a world city, and it created the towns of Buffalo and Albany and Syracuse and Utica all along that canal, that wonderful industrialization that took place. I can remember standing in Albion and looking at the sites and having the local historian tell me how there was a pole sticking out of one of the buildings where they would raise up the costumes for the traveling operas and the traveling minstrel shows that traveled along the canal. And at the same time, you have all this beautiful architecture, and all of the first floor establishments are empty because the towns have emptied out and kind of left that ghost town. So that's when we started getting the folklorists in New York State together and applying for funds, and eventually starting to do some research on the canal. For those of you, just to remind you, built at a time in 1825 when most canals were less than 2 miles long, and the longest 27, at a cost of an unprecedented $6 million from the New York legislature. The canal was one of the great engineering marvels of its time. 363 miles long with 83 locks and 18 aqueducts, including an 800-foot water bridge across the Genesee River. And it was nicknamed, of course, Clinton's Folly or Clinton's Ditch, and it promised to make New York the granary of the world, the emporium of commerce, the seat of manufacture, the focus of great moneyed operations, and so it did. And we like to talk about the fact that when it was built, a lot of veterans were still around from the American Revolution, and it became a kind of vindication of what free people could accomplish with digging a canal really by hand. There were no engineers in the United States, and they figured out how to move trees. They devised a contraption on how to move trees, and they literally, in the words of folklorist Bruce Jackson, dug the son of a bitch out. They dug that canal by hand, and one of the things that one of the historians that worked with us talked about it was that what it did was also spawn a kind of what she called the parallel between the 1840s along the canal region and the 1960s in San Francisco, because it suddenly, the women's rights movement started in 1848 in Seneca Falls. The abolitionist movement was there. A lot of the utopian spiritualist movements were there, and it was because of the prosperity it brought. It created a cultural revolution as well in its time. And of course, since then, all of that manufacturing, Rust Belt has given away to the Sun Belt, and a lot of that industry has moved out of the area. You know, to give you one example, stated by a steel worker in Lackawanna, I heard about the closure of the steel mills, Bethlehem Steel, on television on the 6 o'clock news. Then a couple of weeks later, they phoned me up and said, you got a 35-year pin that we have here. We'd like to give it to you. I said, okay. He said, meet us at the front gate. You know, everything was closed. So the fellow, our superintendent at that time, he gave me the 35-year pin. You can picture a chain link fence. He handed the pin to me through the fence, which I often thought was kind of poignant. We've worked in addition with many folklorists. We've worked with a variety of historians, including Mike Wallace and Andrew Robertson and Rob Snyder. And we especially like to quote Wendy Wall, who kind of summarized a lot of the project for us, when she said, I think in a lot of ways, the story of the Erie Canal really reflects the story of the nation as a whole. If you think about the early 19th century, the story of the Erie Canal is one of nation building, the industrialization of America, the market revolution, the incredible fluorescence of reform and religious movements that went along with that, and of course the opening of the West with the immigrants who traveled westward on the canal. It represents in one locale all that energy and optimism that in some ways made America. If you look at the 20th century, it's the story come full circle. The story of the Erie Canal becomes one of deindustrialization, of an emptying out of population, of a movement to the Sun Belt away from the Rust Belt, of globalization, and the impact of that on the American economy. And she actually, tears kind of well in her eyes, which makes it such a great interview actually on film, but she goes on to say, but I don't think it's an entirely hopeless story, because if you look at what's happening to the canal, in cities and towns all along its route, communities are trying to make use of the canal in new ways. It's now an engine for tourism and economic development. So it's really a story of America reinventing itself. In many ways, that is our story. And on my panel tomorrow, I just got back a few weeks ago from interviewing some of the folks affected most by deindustrialization, the steel workers, the mill workers who worked at the textile plants along the canal, and the grain scoopers who came to be along the era of the canal and then later worked on the Great Lakes. And finally, the last grain scooper was let go in 2003 by George Steinbrenner, who owned the Yankees and the big shipping company that employed all of the grain scoopers. So I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. But what I wanted to do now was just to focus a little bit about the work that was on the canal itself. For a while, we had the good fortune on this project to work with Gabby Berlinger, a student at Indiana University, who spent a summer as an intern for us, traveling the length of the canal, doing interviews for us. And she discovered Steve Wonder and his wonderful tugboat at a wedding, right, that was taking place along the canal. A wedding on a boat on the canal. Okay. And we started to work on this documentary film that would tell this great American story and to do this research. And we did some small modules based on some of that work. And I wanted to start out not by showing the piece on Steve Wonder, but showing you his partner, Dave Gower, who we wish we could have brought here as well, who also works on the tugboat Seneca. And then we'll show you a little piece about Steve Wonder.
I came to work on the canal system in 1981. One of the old captains that had, well, in the shape that I'm in now, probably 26, 30 years, pulled me aside and he says, how you like it here on the canal system? I said, good. He goes, what boat are you on? I said, I'm on the tug Seneca. And he says to me, well, let me ask you this. He goes, you like to drink beer? I said, yeah, I love to drink beer. And he goes, do you like to play cards? I said, I love to play cards. He said, well, the third question I got is, do you know how to keep your mouth shut? And I said, absolutely, I know how to do that. And he said, well, you'll be fine on the canal system. And I guess he was right, because 26 years later, here I am. The people that I met along the way, one in particular that stands out, and he was an old salty captain. He had a very harsh way of dealing with you. He never said anything real soft. He'd always talk like this to you. He'd tell you, get a line over here on that cleat. We'd be out picking buoys. Tie that line off on that forward cleat. Come on, get it over there. Hurry up. Tie it off. And he'd tell you, this is not the first day we've ever done this. He's a great guy. He's a very compassionate man, but boy, I'll tell you, everything was always yell, you know, get that line over there, get the pike pole, get that buoy before it gets away, you know. And it was guys like that that actually made up the history of the canal. One of the things they said to me is pay attention to what these guys tell you, because they've been doing it a long time and they know how it's done and how it's done right. And 26 years later, I'm repeating the same knowledge exactly the way I was taught to younger guys coming on now, but it's a whole different breed. And if you took any Tom, Dick, or Harry off the street and brought them on, they go nuts. They're pacing. When's this boat gonna tie up? When can I get up? You can't. I mean, we can get a boat and take you to shore, but it takes a special breed to come on here and do the jobs that we do the way that we do them, the way we were taught. I'm determined in my head that I'm going to find somebody that's going to come on this boat as an oiler, and you're going to learn, you're going to really want to learn what's down there in that engine room, and I'm going to pass that all, and you're going to know, because it's going to be somebody that listens, that does everything repetitious the same way, and they know the smells and the sounds, and they like those, they like that, you know.
Okay, now Steve gets to see himself for the first time on the video.
'Twas a night before digging, and the lads of the river were ashore in the riverside, taxing their livers. A late night's reverie, and early to rise, telling tall stories, or should I say lies. Dipper Dredge 3, I'll say most sincere, was the best bloody digger I've ever been near.
Not a day that goes by that we don't mention it. We got to see the Dipper dig. I mean, when you pulled up to it in the morning, didn't it look like some big prehistoric?
It was, every part of it
dinosaur?
was alive.
Yeah,
it was
amazing.
groaning. You'd see the steam go up and we go, she's ready. Somebody looking the other way say, I didn't hear anything. And then you'd hear the whistle. Because it was a mile out, you know. It took a good almost 5 seconds. Right there, the Dipper Dredge, you have a person that rides right here and dumps the load. There's a cable that opens up the bottom of the bucket. Then there's the guy they call the monkey, or they used to anyway, Ernie. He was the operator in here. Everybody had a job to do. You had a boilerman that fired up the boiler. You had an oiler that took care of all the engines. The operator, he had levers that swung, and then the other guy would control the depth of the dig. So everybody had to work in unison to make this do what it had to do. That boat was spotless. When I first saw it, I couldn't believe how something that old was so perfect. So they didn't let you touch it. You know, it was like a museum piece. It was like a work of art. It's an amazing piece of equipment that's no longer. There is no more. Those two guys right there, that was at Ernie's retirement party. And Ernie was something else. He's the one that lost his teeth in the canal, so every time they saw a fish, they, hey Ernie, I think that one had your teeth. I'm pretty sure that fish was smiling at you. Oh, you knock it off. He'd get mad. Oh, and Kenneth Beagle. They'd have a meeting. We'd have safety meetings before the Dipper would dig. So Ernie being the captain, he would come and say, okay, Beagle, come here. We got to have a meeting on the quarter boat. And then, Earl, come here, everybody. Name everybody, and they'd all come. And then Beagle couldn't help it. He could not sit without interjecting. Somebody would just move and just, you'd hear Beagle would go, quiet, the chief's trying to talk. Give the guy some respect, will ya? And he'd swear and yell. And then he'd say, go ahead, chief. You got the floor, head honcho. And then he'd stay right on it. And, will you shut up, Beagle? I'm trying to talk. I hear that, but you're not saying anything. You know, and he, oh God, it would just be one, Beagle, will you shut up? I'm ordering you to shut up. Oh, geez, now he's barking orders. Hail to the chief. You know, and he'd just start right in. He just never give up.
That's what made it so good, you know. And Kenneth R. Beagle, the ghost of the Dipper. I told you. The ghost of the Dipper, his hammer still singing the song of the chipper. There's Dale who watches the boiler with care, getting up steam with oil and air. The scows are now empty, the boiler is down. Nothing but memories, no whistle, no sound. There, I did it. I didn't think it could be done.
One of the things I love about Steve is when you call him on the phone, you always get the answering machine to say, "Wonder here." So I wanted to start off by asking you, did you see much commerce on the canal when you got started?
Did it just get real hot in here? Yes, I did. Yeah, there was quite a bit of cement barges and tugs. Then the odd thing would come through every once in a while. We usually didn't know about it until we ran into it. It would be on our level.
We've talked about the fact that the Day Peckinpah, which was the last commercial ship really to work on the canal and carried cement. What's happened to the Day Peckinpah?
Yeah, this is something. People that used to work on it would probably not believe it, but it used to carry concrete. It was said it'd carry about 110 truckloads of concrete. And now it has a museum in its hold where concrete used to be. So the workers, if you ever 25, 30 years ago said that to anybody that worked on there, they'd think you were nuts. And it's not just that boat, it's all of them. You know? They all are finding new ways of doing things.
I remember you used to joke about the fact that New York State was famous for getting rejected by Washington to build the Erie Canal, and then built the Erie Canal with state money, and then enlarged the canal with state money. And lo and behold, now they want to get a bike trail, right?
Right, yeah. They went and expanded the canal at least twice, the barge canal, eliminating the mule power for the favor of engines and tugs. And they had a perfectly good towpath, and the big joke is now they want a bicycle trail going all along the barge canal when they had a towpath to begin with.
And then apparently you were telling me that they were trying to get federal money for the bike path.
Yeah, they were getting federal money. They couldn't
get money for the canal itself, but now for the bike path they were going to get federal money.
Well, they succeeded. Everything's good now. It keeps things going, I'm sure.
So you had talked to me about the canal as a kind of living thing.
Yeah, the continuity of the workers are what keep it going. That's why I'm here today, is the way I feel. Is a lot of the workers that have come and gone, like Dave. Dave said it best. He was taught a certain way, and you're honoring the ones that taught you by teaching someone else the same way. And apparently you can't teach them the same way, just like the guys I learned from thought I was an idiot. And now I think the ones that are there are idiots. It's only the rite of passage, and you got to earn it, Dave said it best, I think, in the movie.
So did you say you could do one of the whistles?
The dipper dredge? Yeah. The dipper dredge had a couple whistles. It had a spud whistle and it had a house whistle. And the peanut whistle would raise the spud so they could advance where they were digging. And you could tell pretty much what they were doing. They were loading a scow full of mud. And you could tell just by listening to the whistles how far along they were before they would call for a tug. And I said it in the movie that Steve filmed, but it wasn't too understandable. But I think what I was getting at is a lot of times if you were paying attention, what the dredge would be digging a mile away, and you'd see a huge plume of white smoke, steam go up in the air, and you'd say, there it is, they're ready for a scow. And the captain would say, I didn't hear anything. And then a minute later you'd hear, there it is. So then we'd cast off and go out and grab the scow. We'd take them an empty barge and hook on the full one, and then we'd go out and dump it clean it all off with hoses and everything and rewind all the pockets and come back in with an empty one standing by. Usually they had the other one filled by the time you got back, depending on how good the digging was.
Somehow it seems like a lot of families work on the canal. I mean, the families go back many generations.
Yeah, that's still true. You know, there's a lot of families, the Coins come to mind. They had tugs, and then they also worked in the maintenance. When they retired, they came to work on tugs. After they retired from one tug, they'd go work on another one, and they would just take it easy and cook or throw a line now and then, and throw beer off bridges and whatever else they had to do.
Didn't you say you met how'd you meet your grandfather? Didn't you say you saw him?
My grandfather worked on the canal. He used to fire the boilers on a lot of the boats. And he was known for pretty much being a poacher at the time. He would fish a lot and feed the crew, and they'd go for ducks and everything else, in some not too legal ways back then. But he was known for kind of wearing a one-piece union suit all the time, and it was underwear basically, because it was hot. But no one would see you. Who cared? And you know, today it's getting so you can't even pee off a boat anymore, is what they like to say, you know, because of the boat that Steve rented and came on the canal. When that first came about, everybody was calling them targets, because these people, you know, they're going, what in the heck are they doing, you know? No, you don't know where they're going to go. They're like a sailboat. Just all of a sudden, it's like somebody goes, oh, look, there's a beer sign, and they rear in front of you, so you'd have to try to stop a barge, and they were just called targets, like sailboats were. And, but now they're accepted, of course, you know. They're our bread and butter. We don't really aim for them, you know. So, but that's the future, you know, the bicycle path and the tour boats, and all the canal workers have gone along right with it, you know. It's the first bunch were a hard nut to crack, though, I gotta say. A lot of them wouldn't have gone for the ones that taught me wouldn't have gone for what's going on now. The dipper dredge used to dig like crazy, and then in 1986, I believe, there was an arts council of some sort funded a project to put steam whistles on the dipper dredge, and it was gonna go from New York all the way to Buffalo, blowing whistles. The guys on the boat are scratching their heads and just couldn't fathom this, you know. Well, now I've heard everything, you know, and several of them refused to go. They said, that's it, I'm not firing the boiler for a bunch of idiots, you know. And it turned out really well, though, but that was the first turn of events that kind of went from a hardcore dredge to get mud. You know, their main goal back then was to get a snapping turtle for lunch out of the mud, you know, and then all of a sudden some lady from New York wants to put whistles on this boat and tow it all the way across the state. They just were like, what? You know? But,
I knew that they had done that. I didn't quite realize that it was really part of the beginning of the tourist era.
Yeah,
on the canal.
From my point of view, it was. It was the first really ludicrous type thing that everybody, it was just.
Until we came along, right?
Yeah. Well, no, you're distant third on that. Yeah. Most enjoyable.
So there's still some old traditions that do continue along the canal. One of them being rope fenders, right? Are there still rope fender makers on the boats?
Yes. Yep. The deckhand on the Seneca, Leroy Lewis, he makes fenders out of manila line, 2-inch manila line. He takes it all apart, and they used to say that the best fenders are on the boats of the worst captains, because if you got real big fenders, the deckhands are just trying to protect themselves. They hang fenders all the way around the boat, so no matter what you slam into, there's no damage. And so
but it's actually braided, right? They're
yes.
braiding the rope.
Yeah, a lot of different ways of making them, but they're usually just a series of half hitches, and they can weigh a couple 100 pounds apiece.
So I thought I'd ask you about some of the stories about the canal, like the Dan Carney going.
Don Carney.
Don Carney.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. We had a fellow that went over a dam. Three guys were trying to retrieve a buoy in January, and they didn't want the buoy to go over the dam, so they went out in the boat, and the boat wouldn't start. Well, it quit, and then it wouldn't start. And Don was very cool. He was nothing fazed him. Fires didn't faze him. 7-ton objects dropping right next to him didn't faze him. Nothing bothered this man. And just before he went over the dam, the two guys abandoned ship, and he said, "Don't panic, grab an oar." That was it. And that was the last I saw of him. He went right over the dam. He didn't even grab an oar. He just sat there. Yeah, Don was known as, he was one of the guys that taught me.
So what happened when you fished him out?
Oh, I didn't fish him out. I wasn't even involved in that. But the fire department picked him up, and he asked him if his cigarettes were wet. And then he asked the EMTs what they did with that fish. You know, he says there was a fish in his pants when he got there. So, that could be taken two ways, I guess.
So didn't you tell a story too about the old lanterns and how people would mess up the lanterns?
Yeah, I always heard that there were certain buoys on the canal system. They were kerosene lights, and there were certain places along the canal that they kind of got Mrs. Morgan's buoy. Kids would swing out or swim out to the buoy, and they would dunk the lantern, and the light would go out. So the shippers, back then they didn't have radios, so the guys on the barges and the tugs would tell the lock, "Your light's out at Mrs. Morgan's kids again." You know, it was always somewhere along the way the kids would go out and they'd drain the lights off the navigational aids on the canal because they were kerosene. So that's how a lot of them got nicknames, different areas. They're all reflectors now. So there's no maintenance. They get shot up all the time.
So the thing that strikes you when you're on the canal is that it's very much, you know, it's left over from it's a mechanical era.
Yeah.
Right. The locks are all mechanical. You know, it's not an electronic era. It's a mechanical era.
The continuity of the workers, I think, is the lifeblood of the whole canal, because like the kerosene lamps had to be lit, and the wicks had to be trimmed, the glass had to be washed, and there was a certain competition among the buoy tenders years ago, and that all ended in 71 or 70, I believe. Now they're reflectors. Now they have battery-operated LED lights, and it used to be a big deal to pull buoys. We used to have to do it with a derrick boat now, and we had to set them with a boat and a tug and a scow, and we had a burning barrel, and it was a big production. And now they're foam buoys with small weights, and we can just launch them right off a barge, and then you set them in place by GPS. And as little as 25 years ago, somebody would just shake their head. But it's all changed, and it's simpler. So you can do what we used to think was a lot of work is now almost nothing. One person could do what 5 used to, and not burn 400 gallons of fuel a day.
So did you heard stories about the mule-driven canal from the people that you?
They usually just compared the mules to the present-day tug captains, Steve. It's, you know, bullheaded and stuff like that. But I heard some.
So how did they keep the mules' feet dry? That's what you told me. The kids always ask you.
Stilts. I used to work on the tug urger, and that's an educational tug that goes all across the state. And 4th graders have a field day. They come down and they see the tug, and there's been several crews over the years, but it's been going on since about 1990, 1989. I think they used a different tug, but the urger's been actively giving tours to 4th graders all across the state for 20 years. And I used to do that, and that was quite rewarding. But there again, all the old timers are saying they're ruining a perfectly good tug for show and tell. They said, "Oh, they're all going out." They call this showboat, Hollywood, all kinds of nicknames. But it still was a routine that you really had to fall in. You know, you'd tell 6
6 classes a day of 4th graders all about the canal. By the end of the day, the teachers don't even do that. They said, you know, did I already tell you that? And the kids are looking at you like, you know. But the kids were a good place to start on the canal. But I've always found that if you don't know, ask a 4th grader, because they know what to ask. Some adults are afraid to ask. They don't want to look stupid. And that's what I learned from 4th graders, is that a kid will always ask. But a lot of adults, they don't want to, you know.
So do you think that the tourism and the educational programs and the museums and so on, like the Day Peckinpah being fixed up as an exhibit, do you think that's going to help revitalize the economy of the area?
Absolutely, it already has. Yeah, the people in charge of the canal today are doing a real good job. They have the pulse on the towns. Our director is amazing. She goes to every town and they do murals. They have what they call mural mania. They're painting old abutments. My great grandfather was in charge or on a gang. You like to think they're a little better than they were, but he probably was just on the gang. But they actually build forms for an old abutment for the trolley, the Rochester, Syracuse, and Eastern trolley. And I have pictures of them at home that have been passed down. And on this very same abutment that my great-grandfather was pouring, our director on the canals, Carmela Montello, she cut a ribbon opening that part of a bike path, and that very same abutment is now a mural of present-day Lyons, New York. And she came and she presented it in a wonderful way, and the town shows up and they participate. And here again, the guys that are dead and gone now, the old canalers, would be scratching their head going, look at what it's gotten down to, you know. They would be totally disgusted in one way, you know, but that's what it is now.
And they were thinking of closing the canal at one point. I mean, it was that before the tourism.
82, I believe it was. They called, don't pull the plug. They had to really fight to keep the canal from being closed west of 3 Rivers, which is up the land cut, they call it. Most of it's land cut. Anything west of Lyons to the Niagara escarpments, all land cut. And they were going to close that, and somehow they decided that they better come up with a plan to save the canal, and that's when it started to turn over into this bike path and the preservation. And recently they just moved a bridge from one area of the canal to another area of the canal to preserve it. It's the old trestle-type bridges that are so familiar on the canal. They're starting to save those now.
So do you have any questions, or if any of you have any questions, we'd love to be able to hear from you.
Me being invited here. I'm honored, by the way. Yes.
Peggy?
Steve, I'm just wondering that you are passing on, you said, some of the same teachings that you got from the old timers, but what are you passing on that is new, that the old timers didn't know about, that you're now having to pass on?
Tolerate people that are in charge a little more. Be kinder, you know. Well, 25 years ago, if a canoe showed up at the lock, you would tell them, what, are your legs broke? Can't you carry it? You know, they wouldn't want to run a lock for one canoe. So I think what we bring to the canal today is we go out of our way to make people feel like they want to come back. And every canal worker does that. They will leave their job after work and take you shopping if you're stranded. They will help you fix your boat 9 times out of 10. And they'll make sure you get where you have to go safe. They'll give you a trash bag for a raincoat if it's pouring. You know, they'll help you any way they can. And in the old days, that wouldn't have happened. Well, it would have to an extent, but not the way it is today.
Sure.
Oh, they have to dredge the canal all the time, and what we do now is usually with a hydraulic dredge, the turbidity is an issue. So all mechanical dredging is usually frowned upon. Hydraulic dredge goes to an upland disposal site, and it's the most efficient, economically friendly, I guess it is.
I mean, I remember you told me that, I mean, the canal used to be, it's much cleaner now than it was, right? It was, it was, people used to, when they were canning beets, you would be able to see the, you know?
Yeah, when I was a kid growing up, they had canning factories, and all the trimmings from all the vegetables would be floating in the canal, and the carp would be trying to get air. All you'd see is their lips on the surface of the canal, and they're dying to get some oxygen. We used to kid around that they had lipstick on, you know, when they were canning beets or something. The water would take on kind of a reddish hue, and the carp would have lipstick. And now the water's so clear, you can see the bicycles and tires on the bottom. It's clean as could be.
Also, another change is that you know, when you go on the canal now, it used to be that the canal, you know, it was not considered desirable to live right on the water. And now everybody wants a house on the water. So
yeah, I have an issue with that. I live on the canal. I live right on the Seneca River in Montezuma, and we have high water quite often. And they say waterfront. Well, why would you need a sub pump in your attic? Because it's very wet. Most of the canal is controlled very well, you know, but nature does hit, and it is a swamp. And what we find in the past is people had camps. They were allowed to have camps in the cattails. They would just hunt. And then all of a sudden their camp isn't good enough. They get rid of the outhouse and they get running water, and then they put a roof on it, and it gets better and better and better. And before you know it, they have a year-round home in a flood zone. So I'm one of those people. It's like, I always say, don't build your house on a fault and complain about an earthquake. You know? But
yes, the lady on my left.
for you,
no, for you.
canal-wise, you mean? Yeah. The shipping is all basically trucks. It's faster. The asphalt, they used to have an asphalt plant up in Lyons, and a barge would come through and they'd have to keep it heated. And now there's trucks all over the place. They come and go all day long, day and night, moving asphalt. It used to be one barge a week coming up from New York to Lyons. So the asphalt plant's still working, but it's basically by truck. And the home heating oil, I guess now, is mostly pipelines, trucks.
And it is, the area as a whole it's one of the poorest areas in the United States. Upstate New York is one of the is equivalent to one of the lowest income areas in the United States. However, whatever money there is there tends to go right to the waterfront, so you don't see it so much along the canal itself.
Yes.
The new workers coming are less skilled?
Are they less skilled or more skilled, or the skill sets different?
I really have to say most of them don't look at it as they're going to be there forever. When they come as a seasonal job, they're looking to go to school. They're looking to better their education, most of them. And they either know it all or know nothing. It's typical, but they don't really look at the canal as a future. They look at it as a way of getting where they're going, a temporary job a lot of times, because it's hard to move up now. There's too many regulations for like a mariner's license and things like that, and a lot of them aren't willing to bite it.
One of the things we've been able to do is go to the, some of the machine shops that keep the locks operating. And the machine shops have to make basically make parts that are no longer made anywhere else. So they basically have to preserve the technology to make the nuts, to make the bolts, to be able to fix the various machinery that actually opens the locks, because it's such, you know, there's so much not used anymore, and that the fact that they're used on the canal requires its own specialized machinery to be able to keep that mechanical canal operating.
Yeah, it's all gears.
Yeah.
7 horsepower motors are moving 30-ton gates through a series of gears. And if a gear breaks or shears a tooth, they have to pour another one. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Yes?
Who pays for the upkeep and, you know, making sure the canal is, you know, can be used? Who makes the stake or who?
The financing, I believe most of it's the thruway through out-of-state truckers, we like to think. You know, when the thruway first took over, a bunch of canal workers made up T-shirts with pirates on boats at a toll booth, just grabbing bags of money, and they actually made shirts up like that. So the thruway and the canal system logically got together to keep the canal going. The thruway basically saved the canal, and they infused a lot of money towards tourism, and it's working. People love the canal system.
Do you know how much a year it costs you?
How much a year does it cost? We don't know.
I have no idea. I try not to think about it.
It is. We have talked about. I have been to some of the seminars with John Callahan and so on, with other people who runs the Day Peckinpah, and people are worried because it is funded by the state. It keeps to be able to keep that canal open is an expensive proposition. It does come through the New York Thruway system, and there is a lot of tourism on it. But they lobby every year, just like the Library of Congress does, to keep themselves open and running and in good shape.
Got time for about one more question, if there is one out there. Yes.
One great question. But how many active canals are there in the country?
How many active what?
Canals.
Canals.
Oh, I couldn't even begin to guess. I know there's several that are still working. Several little ones. The Welland Canal I hear on the radio all the time, but as far as a working knowledge of them, I just know the Erie Barge Canal in New York. I know where more ruins are of ones that don't exist any longer. I kind of like going around and looking at all the old stone locks that used to be and finding out what was and why it didn't work. But as far as, I really couldn't answer that. I don't know.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for your questions, and thanks especially Dr. Steve and Captain Steve for telling us about their work up along the Erie Canal. Let's hear it for them.
Good afternoon. My name is Linda Deloge. I'm facilitating this second panel. Welcome. Documenting a transformative moment, stories and statistics about work. Our panelists will proceed in the order seated, followed by a moderated panel discussion, then a question and answer period. Please read the biographical information that's in the symposium schedule. I'm not going to use time to read that here. If, like me, your memory is fairly reliable, but you experience what we call those senior moments, I encourage you to take notes. There will be a question and answer period in the last half an hour. If you have just joined us for this afternoon session and you haven't already done so, please silence your cell phone. Thank you. Our panelists were asked to address some thematic issues that are also printed in your schedule. They include work-related narratives, what they tell us about this historical moment, looking at stories and statistics and how they can be more effectively blended. And thirdly, transformation of documentary media and how that might, in fact, impact the role of employers, scholars, creators, those of us who actually do the work. More specifically, Devera Cohn, who is senior writer at the Pew Research Center, will address demographics as a structure for stories about work. Richard Dabadi, executive director for the Maine Historical Society, will share his experience with the Maine Memory Project, emphasizing work narratives. Robert McCarl, 2010 Archie Green Fellow and a sociology professor at Boise State University, will focus on his recent field experiences in Idaho's Silver Valley within the broader context of workplace and environmental change. So I invite you to engage your senses and also your listening skills.
Engage your senses, and I might add, as someone who follows the Census Bureau, engage your census. After hearing the last panel, I realized there are not many jokes you can make with numbers, so you take the ones you can get. So my presentation is going to be in two parts that I hope to knit together successfully. One, the first part I will use to talk a little about the demographic context of changes in the workplace and in the workforce. And in the second part, I'll talk some about the use and misuse of statistics. I'm going to race through these slides, but I'm happy to email them to anyone who would like to see them in more detail. The first couple of slides are of some population projections that we produced at the Pew Research Center in 2008, looking at what will happen to the US population between 2005 and 2050 if current trends continue, that is, current trends of immigration, birth rates, and so forth. And as you can see, the population is going to rise, no big surprise, but the interesting part is how it's going to rise. And what we found is that the vast majority of the change is going to be in the arrival of immigrants starting in about 2005 and in the children and grandchildren who will descend from them. That also will have an impact on the workforce. Now, traditionally, we've used the years 18 to 64 to talk about who is in the labor force, who's available to work. And as you can see from this slide, which showed numbers from 1960 and 2005 and our projections out to 2050, the working age population in future years will be much less white, much more Hispanic, and somewhat more Asian, and only slightly more black than it is today. The next slide refers to the share of the workforce that we anticipate, or the working age population that we anticipate will be born in another country. Now about 15%, we anticipate, or we project that it will rise to about 1 in 4, 23% by the year 2050. People tend to immigrate as working age adults, and so that there's no surprise that it would rise, but 1 in 4 is a pretty hefty number. As I said, I'm racing through. My next few slides will be on the changing workforce, that is, who's actually in the labor force. And as you can see from this area chart, the share of the workforce, or labor force, people who are working or looking for work, has changed by gender somewhat dramatically, that about half of workers are now female. And as a subset of women, most mothers are now in the workforce, including about 60% of mothers of children younger than 3.
I'm not even talking about the context of these numbers. I'm just anticipating you can figure them out for yourself, but I'm happy to take some questions on these topics later. Then let's look at age. So as I said, 18 to 64 is the traditional working age, but as you can see, the share of people who are working or looking for work at 65 and older has gone up. And if you look at the two lines that cross in the middle of the slide, the share of workers or workforce participants who are 16 to 24 has dropped. The share late 50s to mid 60s has risen, and now there are more older workers than younger as a share of each group. This slide, next slide, I'm just going to click through quickly. It's the actual, if maybe you could do next slide for me. Thank you. These are just the actual numbers that go with that. Yeah, I think I need my technical help. Thank you. Here's another way to show this kind of change. That, as you can see, the bottom share, the dark area, the young workforce, that's dropped in share of the total. And the oldest, 55 plus, is now a larger share than it used to be. Then, here's another way of looking at workplace change or at data on workforce. What the Pew Research Center does is combine demographic data with survey research. And we did a survey in 2009 talking to people who were employed and said, do you work because you need the money or because you want to work? If you look at the dark bar, that's workers under 65. About half of them say, 49%, they work because they need the money. But the 65 and older who say that is much lower. Work because they want to work. A higher share of the older people say that. And then my last slide is the result of another survey we took in 2010 that is a very telling indicator, I think, of the impact of the recession on America's working population and more broadly on its households. We asked currently employed workers and the total labor force a number of questions about, did this happen to you since the recession began? And among those currently employed, we said, were your work hours reduced? Did you take a cut in pay and so forth? Among the total labor force, we said, were you unemployed at any point during the recession? And that bar at the bottom, that 55%, that reflects the total share of adults to whom something happened related to their job since the recession began. So more than half. And if we had asked this question about someone in your household, I think it would have been an even higher share. So I think, again, this is a very telling indication of the impact of the recession, one in which unemployment, and especially long-term unemployment, has been a distinct feature. So that's the last of my slides, and let me just turn in the time that before Linda starts kicking my foot to the second section, which I wanted to talk about how numbers can and should be used to inform narrative. Linda asked me to say a few words about census data. And I guess as a prelude, I should say that the census put out some numbers today that are perhaps the opening bell to thinking about the 2010 census, which was taken this year. The results will start dribbling out late this year and early next year. You'll start seeing population totals at the end of December. You'll start seeing detail about race, ethnicity, and age starting in the spring, down to very basic block levels, but also aggregated up to states and counties and other units of geography. And these numbers will roll out over the next couple of years. But this census, unlike past ones, will not have the wide variety of what we call long-form data that you used to get from previous censuses, things like income, occupation, commuting time, and so forth. That data has been put or offloaded into the American Community Survey, which is a monthly household survey that's been operational nationally since about the middle of the decade. the numbers for 2010 from that will be coming out, I think, late next year. And that's probably, for those of you who do research on the workforce, those are probably the more detailed numbers you'd want to pay attention to. Another topic that Linda asked me to talk about was survey research. As I mentioned, we do a lot of it, not just the work that I've done in family research and employment related, but also political surveys and so forth. We use a very rigorous methodology that we explain in some detail. I won't bore you with all of it, but if you're interested in a kind of template for how survey research should be done, I'll send you to the pewresearchcenter.org website, to the project, the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press, and to the methodology page there, which explains in detail how we do random digit dialing. We take samples of American adults, what the margin of error is for these samples, how we increasingly are bringing cell phones into the equation, because about 1 in 5 Americans now primarily relies or only relies on cell phone for phone coverage, and therefore the old methods of randomly dialing landlines don't work anymore if you want to get an accurate picture of America, especially of younger Americans. And then lastly, yes, I wanted to mention a few guidelines for using statistics in a responsible way. As I said, I'm racing through this, but bear with me here. I guess the first thing I'd recommend is asking yourself, is the number that I want to use or the number I'm reading about from a reliable source? It's the same kind of thing that you would tell your students or your children about relying on material over the internet. What's the source? Obviously, government research is pretty good. I'd like to think that our own work is pretty good. I guess reliability, trustworthiness of the source is the first consideration. Then you want to ask yourself, and here's a nerd word, what's the universe here? And by universe, I mean, what's the population that's looked at? Are you only asking 5 of your friends, or have you surveyed a representative adult sample, or do you have household data on all 100 million plus of America's households? Or are you taking some other slice? And then the third question I'd ask is, well, how reliable is the interpretation of these numbers? That is there a margin of error? If something says 10%, well, could it be really 7% or 15%? What other quality guidelines do you have in looking at this data? And then I guess I have to allow is how there are a variety of ways in which data can be either spun or analyzed. I was talking with my fellow panelist about a report we put out recently on marriage and family that gave comfort to both the left and the right. They each could pull something different from it. And so that's obviously also something to bear in mind. The topic of income inequality, for example, is something that there's a fair amount of agreement on the fact that there has been a widening income gap, but the reasons for it are still being debated. If you're not much of a user of statistics and you're looking for an easy entry into that world, I guess I'd recommend some of the resources available for journalists who often pride themselves on being numerically challenged and who then need things explained simply and in basic ways. There are a number of guides out there. The Census Bureau actually puts out a guide to the American Community Survey for journalists and has a number of other resources explaining its work. And so I'd recommend you start there for your Statistics 101. And with that, I'll exit.
Hi, thank you for having me here today. I'd like to talk about 3 things very quickly. One is the creation of the main memory network. The next is the growth of a project that came as a result of the main memory network. And then I'd like to, and in that project was the creation of 16 community heritage websites. And then the last thing I'd like to try to do, if I have time, is to read across those and give you at least a couple of thoughts that I've had about that in relation to work. I'm not greatly adept at clicking and doing this at the same time, so we'll see how that goes. When I took the job at Maine Historical in 1996, I didn't know it, but really what I was looking for was a way to promote a shared consciousness of history in the state of Maine. I didn't know if I had the tools. I didn't know what the tools were. I wasn't sure that journals and the usual kinds of things and exhibits and so forth was what I needed, but that's what I had to work with. And then lo and behold, the Library of Congress created the American Memory in 1994, I believe. And I got wind of it through the late lamented Civilization magazine. I don't know if I'm the only one who liked that magazine, but and I thought to myself, this is what I need. That is to say, I need an American memory for the state of Maine. And somewhere in the 90s, late 90s, I was given an opportunity to get a little money from the state, and we decided to create a thing called the Maine Memory Network. And our first idea was that we would create it in such a way that it would let us, the Maine Historical, share our resources with the rest of the state. But I was smart enough to hire a number of young guys, and they said, you know what, you can actually, the whole idea of the internet is that it can go both ways. And that you can create this in such a way that you can build it as a collaborative entity. And that's what we did. So we built a collaborative site, and then we went out throughout the state of Maine and asked organizations throughout Maine to become contributing partners. And they did. And today we have 210 contributing partners. We also built it so that anybody who used it could make their own album, could manipulate it, could annotate it, could do all kinds of interesting things with it. This is a map of our current contributing partners. Right now, Maine Memory has 210 contributing partners, 20,000 plus cataloged and annotated primary documents. All of the manuscripts are transcribed, and it includes many, many kinds of things, artifacts and photographs and so forth. And we are approaching 300,000 unique users a year now. So the goal of stimulating an interest in history really was met, at least on a large scale, by Maine Memory Network. And this is the site and it has many components and is growing like a giant octopus at all times. One of the things we found when we went out to communities and asked historical societies or other people who had material to contribute was that the very act of taking their collections and putting them online was exciting. And not only were they excited, other people in the community were excited, so that people in the school wanted in on it, because they had to really, it would be of value to them if they could help the historical society decide what they would put on from the local, or from their local town, so that it could then have a representation and on and on. And the same with the local library. Many libraries have special collections as well. So what we realized was that while we started out to build a kind of a large representative view of Maine history, what we actually had was a tool for developing local communities and stimulating an interest in history and in working together. That led us to create a thing called the Maine Community Heritage Project, which was funded by, and we worked together with the Maine State Library, and IMLS has funded that project, and IMLS has been a supporter of ours from the very beginning, and we're thankful for that. The project was to, I don't know what, there, this is the dull, the important thing is the IMLS logo here at the top. This is the main community heritage page. And what we did was to offer to the state the possibility for 16 communities to build community heritage projects. And they would build their own websites. And we would help them do that. And we would give them some money to make that possible. We received, and in order to do that, they had to put teams together. And they had to put a team, a library, historical society, and a local school. And the kids would work together, and everybody would begin to decide how this history site would look. We received 85 applications, full applications from communities for 16 slots. Just shows how much interest there was in this project. This is a shot of kids from middle school in Bangor who are at the Bangor Daily News working on the pages that the Bangor Daily News did 4 large pages on each one of the sites in their catchment area. So this started to actually begin to take on big proportions. And in part, it was driven by the excitement of the internet. It's just simply, it's a sexy thing, but also the sense, and I forgot to tell you at the beginning that the context of the coming of Maine Memory was a decision in the state of Maine by the Public Utilities Commission to hook up every school and every library with T1 connections at the least, and then right after that to give every 7th and 8th grader a laptop. So there was, and the reasoning behind all this, of course, was that Maine is a marginal place, economically marginal. We're sort of the banana republic. You know, all the extractive industries, granite and lumber and fish and paper and textiles, had all flourished in Maine and were all sort of moving out, and everyone was worried, and hence a kind of broad interest in the possibilities of technology without actually knowing how they would make a difference. We traded on that, we're proud to say. We created tools, we created programming tools, we created manuals to support people in doing better history, understanding digitization, and so forth. And we also built an interpretive guide to Maine history that was an effort to put Maine history in the context of American history. And we did that with scholars. So we built our own interpretive scheme. And then we asked all of these local teams to start working on their own histories and keeping in mind that they're part of Maine history, that they're part of American history, and they did that. And they went out and they inventoried resources in their communities. They digitized 200 to 300 primary documents. They wrote historical narratives, and then they created websites. And this picture is really the whole reason I came here. And I think if we saw nothing else, this is the town of Lincoln. There are 3,000 people in the town of Lincoln. 200 of them filled a gymnasium to see the rollout of the Lincoln website. It's not one of the best, but it's extraordinary. Those are real people. Those are not virtual images. Those are real people who came out because their kids were involved, because they have anxieties about the future, because they love the idea of actually seeing themselves represented in a way they can understand and that they took a part in. And so the outcomes of all this were an incredible set of skills that everyone who participated in were given, communication, technological, civic engagement. There's a whole list of things. And ultimately coming to the conclusion that local history is not the dreary thing that we often think of it as, but really a dynamic asset in the community. once that starts to happen and once people start to own it across a much wider network within a community, it really begins to get exciting. So, what did we learn? I mean, if we looked at these sites, and we didn't really do this to learn necessarily to learn what I'm going to be talking about at this moment, but when you look at them, a few things come to mind, at least for me, especially when you think about the mill towns, and maybe half of the websites that we built were from mill towns. And the first thing is that, and this is sort of common to all of these towns. The first is that the mill, the quarry, the industry is not just part of the story; it is the story. Many of these towns were built. These are early 19th century, maybe late 18th and early 19th century towns. Come to the river because that's how they could do that kind of work. So that industry was essential to the identity of the town. The second thing is that the ebb and flow of capital that keeps mills going and rising and falling is part of the historical narrative. And again, in Lincoln, which is not the best of the websites, a few of them are superlative and some are okay, but all were successful because they stimulated great public involvement. But in Lincoln, you hear there's a great list of the reorganizations, sales, and supervenings of companies in one particular town, Lincoln Pulp and Paper, 12 between 1890 and 2010. 12 reorganizations, sales, and so forth. And this and the great saga of Lincoln was that in 1968 the people came together to create the financing for Lincoln Pulp and Paper. That's 561 jobs, 50% of the tax base, which they saved. So, and in fact, this ebb and flow of capital is analogous to, and they make this very perfectly clear, analogous to floods and fires. It's part of the almost a natural disaster. Yes, I'm coming. It's almost a natural disaster, the movement of capital. And the narrative about that is always the same. Triumph over adversity, resiliency, persistence of identity. So these narratives are not about discontinuity, they're about continuity. They're not about loss, they're about replacement. And I think that I think it's useful to think about that in that when we sort of think about change and employment and so forth, all of these things that seem fluid and interchangeable, and that we have to measure that against a deep-seated cultural instinct that says risk happens in a particular place. We don't want to move. We want to make this place be our place. This is our town, and so forth. This is what they teach their children. Let's see. This, by the way, is the website that Biddeford did. This is one of the mills, which I should have shown you before. Yep, and floods. And this is a picture of those mill girls. There really is a reason why they stand so close together. It's not just because the camera person told them to do that. There's a bond. Thanks.
Okay. My role, I think, in this is to talk a little bit about what I've been doing in North Idaho and also respond to the other two presentations, see if I can put them in a little bit of a context. And the place where I'd like to start is just to back up a little bit and think about why we do research. You know, that all of us on the panel and many of you here are engaged professionally in one way or another in convincing another group of people that you can do something that's going to, number one, help them, number two, entertain them, number three, help you get tenure, you know, whatever the rationale is. The focus here is the key question of why we are in these communities in the first place. What brings us to these people? What are our honest motivations in terms of our own lives? You know, when I started this project, I was fortunate enough to get one of the Archie Green Fellowships, and so thinking that, you know, I had all these good friends up in North Idaho, I'd go back to Kellogg and sit around with my buddies and chew the fat and collect some stories. Well, North Idaho's an armed camp, right? It's one of the most toxic landscapes in the world, not just the United States. People are pissed. People are angry. They're afraid. And you put all that within the context of what's going on economically in our country right now, and having some bozo from the university, particularly from one that isn't University of Idaho, but is Boise State, you're the enemy. You know, I'm no different from, you know, some other bureaucrat from the EPA or the Forest Service coming in saying, hi, I'm here to help, right? So the key question I think that many of us, you know, need to ask ourselves, and one that I've been sort of searching my own soul asking about is, you know, number one, what am I doing here? And number two, is it only serving my interest or is it serving somebody else's interest? And I'm pretty confident with the first one, right, that I've been doing work like this for a while. I have some skills. You know, I can take sometimes even in-focus photographs of people. I can record what they have to say. I know what a good story is. I'm a fairly affable guy, right? I'm not out to pimp one group against another. And you know, I've got a track record. I can say, well, I worked with this union or I worked with this community and these are the kinds of things we developed. The other part of the question, I think, is harder, right? Because the other part of the question forces us to go beyond the products that we have always produced, all right? I was weaned in this discipline at a Folklife festival, as were many of the people sitting in this audience. There's nothing more absurd than a Folklife festival. I mean, think of it, right? It's theater, but theater in service of education. I'm not saying that Folklife festivals should disappear from the face of the earth, but what I'm saying is that when we framed those theatrical productions out on the mall, and I was involved in some of them having to do with work, just like Steve was saying, workers would look at that and go, what in the hell is wrong with you people? That isn't what we do. One of the ones I worked on was a machinist presentation. Machinists spend 7 or 8 years just in their apprenticeship. They make their own micrometers. They make their own measuring instruments. Well, this is before a lot of the more contemporary measuring instruments. But I'm sure they still do this as part of their apprenticeship. And so what we had out on the mall, which was the only thing that would work, was a clock making demonstration. We had different stations of these guys sort of putting pieces of clocks together. And the only reason that the machinists union went along with it, and the machinists themselves went along with it, was because they were garrulous people like Steve, good-natured people that wanted someone else to understand what their craft was all about. And if this was as close as we could get, and I look back on that, you know, with some embarrassment, but it approximated a world that to a great extent remains hidden in American society, and that's the world of work. Part of that has to be that way. It's like skill. I'll talk more about this tomorrow, but skill is something that is ineffable, right? Once you practice something and are skilled at it, when you enter the tunnel of skill, as it was explained to me by one of the miners, nothing else matters, right? You're thinking, you're involved in a dance. You're involved in a performance that is all-consuming to you and pleasurable to you. You're living at sort of the height of your response to the world, and this is what you have to offer. And it's very difficult then to stand back from that and tell someone or explain to someone how that beauty, how that, what some social psychologists call flow, what does that mean to me? And then you take that and you think 10% of our population is being denied not only a livelihood, but an opportunity to continue that kind of involvement. Not that everyone, you know, I don't go to the university every day and hit the tunnel, right? But maybe once or twice a semester, I'll have a student say something in class that actually relates to something that I've been thinking about. And we have a dialogue and other students join in and there's sort of a thing happens, right? And I leave the classroom and I go, teaching, right? That really does make sense, you know? Something I've been doing for 30 years and, you know, I don't often get tremendous satisfaction from every day of it, but I do get those little windows of opportunity. So the second part of the question I think is much more difficult for us to answer, at least it is for me. You know, am I able to create something out of our interaction, you, the insider, and me, the outsider, that has utility to you or your community? And I think, you know, we go from the days of community journalism, you know, Foxfire on up. I've done I don't know how many little, you know, Bob books, little things that come out of community projects, and I love them. And now we can do them online and digitally, and I think that's important. Obviously, there's a flexibility and an excitement in these communities to do that. Then what? Right? When we have done that, then can we use that in some way? Can we address some of these issues? There's a damn good reason why a lot of people, both labor and management, don't want us clumping about in the workplace. There are things that go on in the workplace, you know, from a worker's perspective that maybe he or she needs to protect for their own safety or their own livelihood. In the old days of craft, right, the old molders would, you know, put their coats around their work so that people couldn't steal their techniques, right? Management, certainly, capital certainly has many, you know, reasons why, you know, they don't let people into the workplace. Or they let you in and you get a white line tour, right? You get to wear safety glasses and a hard hat and they show you the back of all the equipment that's actually dangerous. You know, yeah, we want you to understand our product and our industry, and people often are, not always, but are ancillary to that. So that's one question. The other question is, has to do with examples, and where can we look for examples, particularly with regard to Vera's presentation, where, you know, I come from a background where the debate between qualitative and quantitative is quite toxic in the academy, at least in my experience. I taught for 15 years in an anthropology department that went science, biology based. You know, some cultural folklore wonk like me couldn't survive in that environment, couldn't get promoted in that environment. I eventually switched departments, ironically enough, to a sociology department. But the point is that there is a tension in some people's minds between these two types of research. It doesn't have to be that way, right? Induction, deduction, right? You're working toward, you know, in a general way, you work toward a question inductively, or you start with a question deductively and attempt to prove or disprove it, right? They're both subject to interpretation. They're both subject to various forms of error, but they're both viable. I brought a copy. I used to always be suspect of professors that did this, but This is a great example of what can be done with qualitative and quantitative research, right? Eli Ginsberg's book on the unemployed, published in 1943, was based on studies that we now would look at as not particularly culturally relative. You know, he didn't talk to African Americans in New York City, he did all the work in New York City. But this comes out of the Chicago School, right? Comes out of that notion that social science, or whatever it is we do in folklore or other disciplines, has to matter. And it can matter. I mean, this book had a tremendous impact in terms of the notion, you know, after, at the end of the Depression, of course, then World War II, you know, that changed the whole employment scene. But the notion of what unemployment does to families. And it has a tremendous impact on families, and Ginsberg and his students documented that. But they didn't say, you know, we're going to do these interviews and we're going to collect all of this qualitative information, and then we're going to let somebody else crunch the numbers. What they did is they combined both approaches, and that makes a tremendously powerful document, right? If you're a policymaker, I happen to get involved with an organization that is actually headquartered here in Washington called NELP, that some of you may have heard of, National Employment Law Project. They are the ones that congressmen go to for statistics about all of the unemployment dynamics that are going on. You know, which sectors, you know, they crunch the numbers. And my suggestion to Maurice Emsalem, you know, one of the practitioners of NELP, was you're only telling half the story, right? You need the faces, you need the stories of people that are unemployed, and just simply to say the unemployed doesn't make it either, because there's all different types of unemployed, right? Chronically unemployed, seasonally unemployed, and it really draws into question the notion of our social contract today. Right? If we're going to deconstruct that feeble little infrastructure that as powerful as it is, that was formed, you know, during the WPA, what are we going to put in its place? And I think folklorists and oral historians and other people that do this work have not only a responsibility, but a tremendous opportunity to play a role in putting faces and lives to these numbers, right? It's not the numbers that are bad, or, you know, I mean, we shouldn't put them in a negative, positive light. It's the information. How do we help people use this information, policymakers, people that are trying to decide, well, you know, if I've been a typewriter repair person for most of my career, is this something, you know, that I really ought to keep putting my energy into, or should I move on to some new type of work? You know, and again, these are not local issues. I'm not talking about Idaho. I'm talking about the whole country. One other quick thing, and then I'll stop. The group that everybody loves to hate in North Idaho is the EPA. And EPA has come by that enmity quite honestly. They've done a lot of things that you know, I think they now wish they had done. They've been in North Idaho 30 years, and they've cleaned up an infinitesimal part of the site, and really that hasn't been cleaned up. But the thing that strikes me most, and I didn't really know how EPA operated, EPA has no resident in the valley. The closest person lives in Coeur d'Alene, 40 miles away. The people that run the programs come in from Seattle, spend a couple days talking to people in what they call scoping sessions or gripe sessions, with very few people in the community even go to anymore, because they know that EPA is going to do what it wants to do. And the way in which EPA presents most of its information is in the form of acronyms and numbers. And I can't think of a more, the term that comes to mind, insulting way to present information to people who are living in a toxic environment is to say, look what you're living in, here's the stats, we're going to fix it for you. And that's it. We've got to have a better way to do this, right? There has to be a way to give people an opportunity to tell their story and their perspective and open that process up. Okay.
Thank you. Again, we will have a question and answer period in which you will get a chance to direct your questions to each individual or to the panel as a whole. What I thought we'd do is to sort of direct the question to more general themes so that the panelists actually have an opportunity to basically talk to each other. So with that, I have some questions that I'd like to pose to the panelists. The first actually dealing with project terminology. The symposium title, Work and Transformation, and the overall title for the national project, America Works, focuses on work. So my question to you is this: does the focus on work, as opposed to job or occupation, provide an effective framework for the documentation initiative? And feel free to, it's not a round robin, so as the spirit hits you.
Well, I just talked, so I should wait, but language is important, right? And, I've spent a lot of years doing what I used to call occupational folklore. That's what most of us thought of it as. But you think in terms of these terms: job, occupation, profession, trade, avocation. I think that it's important to interrogate those terms in this, right? Archie Green, who was a mentor for many of us and the namesake of the fellowship, used the term labor law because it brought together his notion of syndicalism, right? Shop floor democracy, and stories, right? Verbal arts. I don't think labor law is ever going to, jump in here as a cover term for all of this stuff. But just as the world of work is changing, I think the specificity and the concreteness of what term we're using and why we're using it. I mean, the notion of profession used to be somebody who wore a white collar, right? Doctor, lawyer, teacher, whatever. The workers were blue collar. And there was actually a book written back in the 60s about pink collar workers. So those things have all changed, right? Firefighters, police officers are professionals. In many cases, they have to have professional degrees, right? So the terms have become ambiguous, and maybe we need to interrogate those terms. I don't know what you guys think about that. But.
Okay. Well, let's move on to talk about public engagement. Whether you have direct or indirect contact, each of you engages a public audience in your work. In thinking about the AFC's initiative to document working Americans, do you agree or disagree that the average citizen must see himself or herself in the project?
Yeah, I think it's, at least from my point of view, it's clear, and it's part of what we've been doing in May Memory, that the sort of the democratization of the exploration is essential. And I wasn't sure whether before you were suggesting that May Memory was sort of Foxfire-like. I actually don't think that's. I mean, I think Foxfire, had an ethnographic model, even though it was kind of dispersed, and we're after a different kind of thing. And I think, I do think that it can't be simply an academic analysis of what's going on. So yes, at least from my point of view, yes, the citizen has to be part.
Yeah, just to clarify that, that wasn't a knock on what you're doing. You know,
no, that's all right.
All I meant by that was that once people reach that critical mass, you know, and I'm sure you can go into many of the communities that many of us have worked in, and there will be a historical sort of midden of community-based projects, you know, some made with old-time, you know, mimeos or whatever. But the point is then, is that a launching pad for what? You know, so what comes next? Is it a revitalization? Is it a, you know, if it's a mill town, does organizing and maybe some of the issues that were built up around organizing, you know, do those little bit hotter topics, you know, are they then used as a, is the information used in some strategic way? That's all I meant. Yeah.
I'd like to chime in with another perspective, which is related somewhat to the digital issue that you've raised in your questions. Not only must the average person be able to see himself or herself in what the work that's done, but that work must be made widely available, and the project should also consider an interactive aspect, whether in the form of comments or opportunity to take knowledge quizzes or in other ways interact with the information being presented, that I think will help people feel more a part of the work that's available, that especially if everybody in Maine seems to have digital access these days, and that increasingly is the case in other households throughout the country. Any strategy you're talking about to disseminate your findings really has to take into account how people will access them, not just through journals, but through web and other widely available media.
Dee, I'd really like you to expound a little more about the statistics and interpretation of statistics. I mean, I think we're all familiar with that expression, there are three kinds of lies, lies, damn lies, and statistics. If you agree that statistics are not lies, how do you nonetheless avoid bias in interpreting demographic data about work?
Well, we're all human. We all have bias. Perhaps the best one can do is to acknowledge what that is and apply standards that you state forthrightly. I think the modern word is be transparent about what you're doing. I mean, I could be provocative and say, but individual narratives also have bias. So there are different kinds of bias that we can use in presenting what we know. I guess I would say that you have to declare what you're doing. You have to be open about feedback. You have to adhere to community or academic standards of ethics in research and presentation. And then acknowledge that we are all human and we'll all see things somewhat differently, but we'll try to find some common ground, at least in some, as I said, community standards.
Richard, do either you or Bob have any comments about bias?
Well, yeah, I think, again, it gets back to the notion that all interpretations are open to bias. There's just a thing in the Post today about ICE and the ICE figures that the Immigration Service has put out in terms of documented versus undocumented workers that have either made it, you know, into El Norte or been escorted back, and apparently somebody fudged the numbers by about 20,000, right? And why should that surprise us in any way? It shouldn't. That once these facts, right, become part of the public discourse, whether they're qualitatively or quantitatively generated, whether they're on film or in print, they're subject to the same ideological pressures as anything else, right? So part of our job as citizens is, as you're saying, monitor that, right? Be able to say, you know, someone comes into the Silver Valley and says, you know, from EPA or DEQ for the state and says, we've cleaned up, you know, this portion of the valley, this whole creek is cleaned up. That's not true. It'll never be cleaned up. You can't get lead out of the dirt. You can put new dirt over it, but it's not cleaned up and it's going to keep leaching lead. Okay, so part of our job, I think, is, well, who in the community has that awareness or professional expertise who I can help get his or her story in the discourse in order to challenge that perspective.
So much of the transformation has focused on work transitioning. I'd like to talk about the transition in technology. I mean, as an archivist, the greatest challenge in my work has been digital-born records and how that actually has changed the content of records that we preserve and how we make those records accessible for research. Richard has the current technology, you know, email, the 2.0 web technology, has it actually transformed your work? And if so, what is your greatest challenge in responding to that transformation?
It's transformed my work, but I don't think it's going to transform your work. You know, I think there's still going to be plenty of problems that it raises. It's you know, the extraordinary connectivity and interaction that the net makes possible is on a scale that we've just not seen before, and I'm not really you know, an advocate necessarily, sort of in my bones, of technical solutions, but there's really no way to avoid that, and it's a tremendous tool, and it allows the dispersion of knowledge in a way that we haven't seen before. So I don't know how it seems to be changing every single aspect of intellectual work, of community work, and really I think we still have much more to learn about how that is actually going to turn out.
Okay. Before yes. No, go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to make sure we're ready. This kind of builds on, I think, what Vera's been saying, and then, of course, I too am a folklorist, so I'm not used to, you know, I think of statistics as being just, you know, those numbers. But you really blew my mind with one statistic that actually speaks to what everybody else was saying, and that is that statistic about how young people overwhelmingly thought of work as something to get money, and older people wanted to work. There's something else going on there. Now, I haven't put it together as to what exactly that means for the United States and the world, but if those statistics are true, this is really very interesting. And I mean, Bob, you had said something about how people they have skill and they have pleasure and they learn something and they have pride, and this is something that is more than making money. This is about who I am. I am a machinist. I am a whatever. And then I think also with the Maine Memory Project, you were talking about those community of workers, like the mill was more than the mill. It was those girls, that was their family. That was more than work. It was more than making money. It was who they were, who they are. And so to me, that just seems like that's what work is to many in my generation and probably older generations. It scares me to think that, you know, I'm hoping that younger people come to that too, and maybe they do, I don't know. But the statistics were really mind-blowing.
Well, if I can offer you any reassurance, I think some of it comes from just stage of life. When you're younger, you're trying to get established, you need to make a living. Some of it may be that as you get older and one hopes is somewhat financially more comfortable, you can choose to work for different reasons. Although, of course, that might be changing. We did ask another question in that survey. We tested 8 reasons for working. You know, do you work because you want to give yourself something to do or be with other people? And that's where you had more older people saying yes. And we asked about economic reasons and employee benefits, and their younger workers are more likely to say yes. So it remains to be seen, you know, why this is. Maybe in those of you who are ethnographers could go out and knock on some doors and find out a little more than we could with our basic survey instrument. But I do think it's possible that it's a life stage issue. And I would also note that about 1 in 3 workers said both money and wanting to work are reasons that they're employed.
We do have some, oh, we do have the mic.
That reminded me as well of Steve Wonder's comment that a lot of the younger workers now are not coming to make life on the canal their life. They're coming as a temporary thing, as something to do before they move on to a permanent job. And so that sounds partly like it is life stage, but also as if it's a different assessment of what would make a reasonable life work.
One of the issues in Maine is that people, young people, are leaving the state, and there's no amount of sort of romanticism about the mill or anything else that's going to stop that. And they're going because opportunities exist elsewhere, and it may be that's what's feeding that idea is, you know, you really do have to find opportunities. And one of the reasons why this project was of interests and generated such appeal in a community is that older people got to talk to their children about how they felt about their place, about jobs, about all of these things, in the hopes that they might not necessarily keep them there, but that the value of what they had built over the years had meaning.
Is it me? Okay. I'd like to follow up on some of Robert McCall's reflections on unemployment and documenting unemployment. And I was wondering how one could translate statistics, for example, statistics on structural long-term unemployment, statistics that may not be easily translatable into stories. How can such statistics be integrated into a large-scale documentation project on working or not working Americans?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had a great answer for you. I think that the life history techniques that Ginsburg used might be one way to get at some of this, particularly since documentary media allows us to deal with people in private space, those that are willing to cooperate with that. And so life history material, people who are going through these experiences, following ways of networks that might exist of people that are in similar life experiences with regard to, I just heard a thing on NPR the other day of these informal organizations of unemployed workers that are using both the web and also face-to-face meetings in neighborhoods to help people, either brush up on their skills, distribute resumes, or find ways to retool for, different types of jobs. I don't think there's any limit to what we can do in terms of the use of documentary and digital media. I think the limitation is trust, really. The idea that I interviewed a few unemployed people, and I was real uncomfortable with it. On the one hand, I needed to get their perspective. On the other hand, you know, I'm doing this project on work, which they knew about, and I'm talking to them because they don't have any work. You know, and that dynamic was a little bit, maybe more in my own mind, but, so you've got to find some way to motivate, you know, people to give you access. I mean, they need to feel as though, if I'm going to get involved in this, what are the chances of any of this information actually helping me get a job? So.
Okay, in opinion polls, I found that the answers you get depend very strongly on how each question is worded, the order you ask the questions, and in oral interviews, the precise script that's used and the tone of voice of the interviewer. As a result, I found that most surveys end up supporting the point of view of whoever's running the survey, because it was basically aimed that way. And as a result, I just don't believe anything I get in opinion polls. Can somebody convince me otherwise?
Well, I agree that survey taking is an art. In addition to the factors you mentioned, there's also things like the gender of the interviewer in some cases will influence an answer. So you have to be very careful. I guess I'd come back to what I said earlier, that there are some institutions that are more reliable than others. I guess as one example of that, I would say to you, well, the polls that were taken before the last election, some were more accurate than others, and you might look at which institutions had an accuracy record. The Pew Research Center had a good one, so that's one reason I'm mentioning this here. But I do agree you have to fight very hard to design questionnaires and the wording of questions and so forth in ways that won't skew the results in one way or another.
Just to follow up on that, I was wondering if, I haven't worked much with the Pew material. I was wondering if your data indicate how many people declined to take the survey, because I know that seems to have been an issue in the election polling that you were talking about. People just refused to be surveyed.
Well, this is an issue that affects not just opinion polling, but also Census Bureau data, and people increasingly are either unavailable or wary for one reason or another. And so you need to use, in some cases, multiple attempts to contact somebody, or detailed type of persuasion, or in the case of our cell phone polls, we offer a very small financial incentive dating from the days when you had to pay money for a call that you made from your cell phone. Now that's less common. So we're not the only institution that has this issue, and you obviously account for that in reporting results. You report margin of error, and you report other kinds of factors that influence the certainty of the statements you can make. But again, this is not just an issue for us. It's a broad issue for anybody seeking public cooperation on any research.
Thought that should be a standard revelation of in the data how many people declined to take the survey.
You know, I have to plead ignorance here. Survey research is not my primary field, so can I just defer?
Yeah, I'd like to. Is this on? I'd like to just follow up on both Robert's comments and Rick's presentation and this issue of use and impact. And I wondered whether Rick could talk a little more about your statement that the project has shown that local history, far from being dreary, is incredibly dynamic and can also be an asset in terms of community perhaps cohesion, and that's my word, so I'm not sure if that's the right one, but certainly community development. And I don't know whether you'd be able to share a few more of the findings from the project around that.
Yeah, I'd like to read one thing which I was going to try to get in, but then I realized this was totally foolish. And this is a letter that we received from the town manager of Guilford. Guilford is a little town that's had a long pulp and paper, lumber history, and there are 940 people in Guilford. And the whole project was actually run out of the Economic Development Office of the town. And he wrote this letter, and you know, this was not solicited or anything. He says, history will live on in Guilford in no small part because of the new bond created between the old and the young, the establishment and the students. Interest has been sparked, common ground discovered, and unity of purpose achieved. He's a rhetorician, you can see. Quite lofty results after all, and yet the components had always been in place. We had a library, a historical society, a school, an economic development board, and obviously even a town office. But it was this project that showed us the interdependence among all the separate groups and caused us to work together for the benefit of all. I don't know, you can believe that or not. You know, we choose to believe it, and the results, you know, the kind of, you know, the turnouts that people have, the continuing work of students, it suggests that we actually have developed a community, we have a community development tool at work. We don't really know what, I mean, it's just the beginning. And as you know, we've got another grant to expand the concept of the Community Heritage Project throughout the state, and also to emphasize the skills that IMLS is calling them 21st century skills, but these are these collaborative, cooperative, technological, and civic engagement skills that seem to be important and necessary. We do not know what the next step or whether you know, towns that are on the brink of disaster are going to be able to pull themselves out of it as a result of having these skills. But certainly there's a tremendous feeling of hope and investment in the process of speaking to each other and sort of creating that sense of self-identity. So we think, we actually think that real work is taking place.
I was thinking the bigger cities like Portland and Bangor and that. I'm somewhat familiar with Maine, but is this thing mainly in the smaller communities or something like Portland?
We tried to choose one community in every county. So there are 16 counties in Maine. We tried to cross class lines, fancy towns, working class towns, bigger towns. Biddeford, for instance, is an old mill town in York County, 20,000 people. The city of Bangor is was one of them. So we have a range of towns representing sort of different economic aspects of the state, in coastal, inland. Guilford, the one I just read, was a sort of a question mark at the end, and I'm really glad we put them in because it was a transformative project in their town. So it was a whole selection.
Oh, okay. Yes. First, a question. Could you identify the communities in Washington County and Hancock County, Maine, that you selected? Do you remember?
I can't tell you at the moment what they are.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then a comment, an answer to the gentleman who questioned. Yes.
Back in Washington County.
Okay.
And I think Blue Hill is in Hancock County.
Yeah. Blue Hill.
Yeah.
Okay. The question about whether or not it's reported, the refusal rate is reported in a survey, and I just say it's a standard practice that one would support that information, would report that information as well.
I want to thank you for your remarks. This has been, in many ways, challenging to think about how we connect the quantitative and the qualitative at this particular moment. And in the session, the topic for this session being this transformative moment, stories and statistics about work, one of the things that's come up in the planning of this symposium and discussions has been an idea that has come up time and time again about what we call career pathways, or the changing ways in which people are assuming different kinds of roles or using their work knowledge in different ways. We heard Steve in the earlier presentation talk about how he was taking his knowledge and applying it in a new context. Do any of the panelists, or can each of you share any thoughts you have if we were to move forward with America Work as we think about it today? And America Works would be a project that would be try to capture this particular moment in time. What is it that's happening today, and how do you see some ways in which we can link some of the quantitative research more effectively with the qualitative, the stories here that can convey the intensity of this moment in American history and how people are responding to it?
Well, I think one way to go about it, and I think it's an important issue, I'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow. The whole generational thing, I think, is, you know, it's a way of getting at, if you can get access to them, a way of getting at not just technological change and the changing, you know, macro or micro environment, but it's also a way of getting at how people look at work differently. You know, the demographic that you pointed out statistically about, you know, how younger people see work. And I think there's an excellent opportunity. I was going to try and pull this off in the project in Idaho, but I failed miserably doing it, to look at work in families, father-son, father-daughter, mother-daughter, whatever. Particularly in small towns, it's quite common for people to follow, whether it's a family business or whatever, for people to follow their, you know, one parent or the other into a particular line of work. Well, that gives you a microcosm of some of these changes. Again, if you can, you know, reach that more intimate level of interaction, and then you could tie that to various demographic, you know, or statistical kinds of analyses. And I think it would be very important for us to learn about that, you know, now that, I don't know if any of you remember, but there was a famous documentary film project called The American Family in the 60s. And they got tremendous access, almost to the point that you know, it became kind of almost absurd in some way. But we need to, you know, rather than have people put on silly suits and jump around in competitions on TV, we need access to what's really going on in some of these families and use their knowledge as a way of helping us deal with change. I think that's one way you could do it.
I have a question that sort of piggybacks on what Kurt was just asking, which is, and it's, I guess, addressed to Devira or everyone, but if there are any statistical studies or statistically anchored studies that look at individual life cycle, I mean, I know there are demographic breakouts according to age or whatever, and the needs that change over, you know, in different age groups, but following, you know, longitudinal, following individual trajectories, besides the Bureau of Labor Statistics longitudinal studies?
There are a whole bunch of them. The ones I'm a little bit more familiar with are a couple that look at demographics, so they've traced, for example, people's pathways into marriage or non-marriage, that sort of thing. I'm not as familiar with ones about careers, so I can't help you there, but it does seem that some of the same surveys that would ask about your marital pathways might also ask about your career and job pathways.
I'd just like to return to the panelists. Any final thoughts you have, either in thinking about the value of narratives, or if there's just one theme or one idea that you would have us leave after the panel? What would that one idea be?
Want to start with me? Or no, start with Vera? Oh, okay. Okay, just one quick thing. I've talked too much, but I was thinking when Richard mentioned looking across some of the collections that you have, that seems to me like a very important thing to do, and it's something that in my experience we haven't done a lot with any of these collections, whether they're WPA. Maybe it's passed me by, it's quite possible, but whether they're WPA collections or whatever these large collections of ethnographic data are, to look at them, in maybe in a spatial way, right? All of the different things that have been collected about Maine. Maine was one of the early areas of occupational folklore collecting. Ex-Dorman Smith and the boomers, the log boomers, and Sandy Ives, and all of these things that have been collected in a space. If we look at them not as one occupation or diachronically, but look at it spatially, right? What's going on in that river, the Kennebunkport, is that right? That's a space, okay? What have we learned from the oral record or the ethnographic record about that space, and what's going on with that space today? What's going on with the Erie Canal. So maybe take the material we have and decenter it in a way, look at it from a different perspective.
First of all, I want to say that I was, my son lives in Saratoga Springs, and I went to my granddaughter's school, 4th grade, and had a terrific presentation on the Erie Canal. So, songs, mules, the works. I learned a lot. I really learned a lot. I guess one thing I'd encourage you to do is to, when you go home, think about who's in charge of local history in your place, and think about that often untouchable group of people that's off there on the side, and begin to look at them with, through eyes that might suggest that they actually could play a really significant role in the community if they only began to think that way. And then maybe, if you want to take the next step, you could actually talk to them and see, see whether there's any openness to do that, and whether if you brought young people in to talk to them, they'd be excited by that, and the process would begin. I think it's just important to recognize what sort of an asset that is, but it has to be pulled out and drawn out and worked with in order for it to become a kind of a modern and contemporary valuable thing.
I guess for my last word, I'd like to talk briefly about, well, once you acquire a statistic or see some numbers that you'd like to use, how should you present them? And one of the more innovative platforms out there that helps to make numbers come alive, I think, is using them effectively in a graphical presentation. That often seeing something in a chart or some kind of visual display will make a number come alive in a way that seeing it embedded in a text will not. And there's some lovely stuff out there that widely available on the web to give you ideas, both for using charts or using interactive material where someone could run a mouse over a number and see something else pop out from it, so that there's not an intimidating forest of numbers, but maybe one number that gets you into a larger group of them. So I guess I would say numbers need not be dull and part of soporific narrative. They can live on their own and be a gateway into narrative or an alternative to narrative for your audiences.
According to folklorists, ultimately in a documentary project, people do not talk about the meaning and the value of work. They will tell a story. So whether you agree or disagree with that viewpoint, I encourage you to really think about the value of work-related narratives, not only in this particular historical time, but the value of those narratives in the past and as we move forward in the future. So please join me in thanking Vera Khan, Richard Tabati, and Bob Coral. And if we can give them a round of applause. And thank you for your attentiveness.
I'm Kurt Dewhurst from Michigan State University and the chair of the Board of Trustees of the American Folklife Center. So let me just join in my colleagues here in welcoming you to this wonderful space, although the pillars make it a bit challenging to set up an event here, but I love this room. Hopefully the sun doesn't add more interest to the session, but we are very, very pleased to have our keynote speaker for this symposium because when we started to talk about who might be an appropriate keynote for this particular focus on work and transformation and the role of oral history at this particular moment in time, the name that we all found ourselves gravitating toward was Steve Greenhouse, who is the labor and workplace reporter for the New York Times. Many of you know his work. Many of us, even in places like East Lansing, look forward to the Times in the morning to see what he has to say. It's amazing how the New York Times has found its way into all quarters of the world in the morning these days, or online, of course. But it's particularly grateful, we're grateful to have him here because he's been both a passionate, thoughtful, and I like to think in many ways from what I see, inspired thinker about work and the changing nature of the work experience, particularly at the beginning of the 21st century. Steve Greenhouse has covered workplace issues now since 1995, and he's actually, and I think this is maybe something that we ought to be working to change, he's one of the few remaining full-time labor writers, labor reporters in the country. And labor reporting used to be something we saw more attention given to, focusing particularly his interests on wage trends, labor unions, immigrant workers, child labor, and the way major corporations treat, and yes, often mistreat their workers. I appreciated when I walked up to say hello that he was wearing a Ralph Fasanella tie. I spotted it from across the room. Many of you know Ralph Fasanella, sometimes called labor's artist, whose work is visible in many museums as well as in labor union halls, and even on the, as I learned the other day, at the subway entry on 53rd Street between 5th and 6th Avenue now in New York City. He became a reporter for the Times some time back. Actually, in 1983, he was a business reporter covering the steel industry and other areas of activity and around work when he was in Chicago for about 2.5 years. He particularly wrote about the Midwest economy during plant closings and large-scale layoffs, something that has been of special interest to those of us in Michigan. In 1992, he became a correspondent in the Times Washington Bureau covering, yes, the Federal Reserve and economic policy, the State Department and foreign policy, but he knew where the action was because after 4 years of that, he asked to cover labor and workplace issues, largely because he was eager to return to reporting about real people. We're very, very pleased to have him with us today and welcome his his comments and thoughts as we move forward with this symposium. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Greenhouse.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Kurt. Before I begin my remarks, I'm going to continue the discussion for a few minutes from the last panel. Someone was saying, can one cite, DeVera was talking about, can one cite a lot of statistics in a compelling way? And I want to say, give a very strong affirmative yes. I was dragooned by the head of the Federal Mediation Conciliation Service to give a speech last week. His main speaker pooped out on him, and I gave a speech, and I started the speech with, a few boring statistics that the nation's corporations are, the last quarter making profits at a record pace of $1.659 trillion. Another boring statistic, the nation's corporations are sitting on a pile of $1.8 trillion in cash, money that could be used to create a lot of jobs and build a lot of plants. The top 1% of U.S. households now earn 23% of all income, up from 8-9% in the 1980s. At the same time, more boring statistics. Wages after inflation for the typical worker are absolutely flat for the past 2 years. In ways they're flat for the past 30 years for male workers, and so statistics might, in a certain sense, seem dry and boring to many people. But if you lay them out, people after my speech in New York last week, several people came up and said, "Wow, I didn't realize that all this is true. That's really bloody wrong." And also a point on narrative before I begin my prepared text. Narrative is incredibly important. I think in this age when people are texting and looking at email and iPods and everything, I think the way you catch people's sustained attention, their intelligence, is by good narrative, and that's damned hard. And I think one of the many brilliant things about Barbara Ehrenreich's masterful nickel and dime was she figured out a way to talk about how American workers are being, pardon my French, screwed in a compelling, readable way that not only the intelligentsia would read, not only pro-worker people would read, but millions of people have read, and that was through the power of narrative. Now, as many of you documentarians know, many of you do terrific narratives, but then the question is, how do you get the world to pay attention? And that's a very tough question that many of us face. When Kurt mentioned when I went from covering foreign policy to the State Department and I asked to cover labor, all these friends at the New York Times said, "You're out of your mind. Why would anyone want to write about labor and workers? That's the most boring thing. It's unsexy." And I said, believe me, I think there's a very fertile terrain to write about. There are 130, 140 million people, workers in the nation. They have many happy, harrowing, meaningful, powerful stories to tell. Okay, now to my boring prepared text. Forgive me. So I'm honored to be speaking at this conference on work and transformation. It sounds much like a title that John Calvin would have selected for a 16th century sermon. That even if you're a wayward soul, hell-bound for damnation, if you work hard enough, you can transform yourself to qualify for a lot of pie in the sky by and by. Let me begin with an embarrassing confession. When I was invited to speak at this conference, which of course is sponsored by the American Folklife Center, I wasn't exactly sure what folklife meant. And I say that even though I grew up listening to Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, Leadbelly, Paul Robeson, and of course the Weavers. And yes, I remember the Pete Seeger song, how many of you do? Newspapermen meet such interesting people. Nice to meet all of you. I flatter you. I'm probably one of the few people in the world who went both to Woodstock and the Weavers' farewell concert at Carnegie Hall. I also went to Paul Robeson's funeral in 1976. An interesting aside, As I was driving home from the church in Harlem where the funeral was held, I saw an old couple in the middle of the street in this humongous downpour getting totally drenched. So my brother and I stopped to pick them up. And who was it? It was E.Y. Harburg, Yip Harburg, and his wife. And those of you might remember Yip Harburg wrote such songs as Paper Moon, April in Paris, Summer Over the Rainbow, Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? So, I was amazed. I was meeting the great Yip Harburg, and he and his wife very nicely invited my brother and me up to their apartment on Central Park West. Wow, an apartment on Central Park West, wow. So he was 80 at the time, and he was just so engaged in asking us, what are the young people of America thinking? Why aren't they more involved intellectually? Why aren't they doing more to help struggling workers? And this is the guy who wrote Finian's Rainbow, right? So talk about folk life. Okay, sorry about the digression. So I was saying that even though I grew up steeped in folk music, I wasn't exactly sure what folk life meant. So I've done a little research, in part by reading the obituary of the amazing Archie Green, and I see that folk life is, and I hope I don't have this wrong, largely the study of folkways and folk mores and folklore of American workers and American communities. Perhaps this is unfair, perhaps this is simplistic for me to say, but my sense is folk life focuses on the culture of workers, their cultural heritage, and what is disappearing, what is being left behind in songs and work traditions and tales and skills and the lives of working people as the United States hurtles blindly into the age of iPhones, iMacs, iPads, iPods, and I. As a newspaper reporter who's written about labor and workplace matters for 15 years now, I do see a lot of that folk life. I often talk to workers in their homes and bars and luncheonettes and in their workplaces. But while folk life experts focus in many ways on the traditional what's disappearing because they want to capture that, our editors press us reporters to focus on what's new. So while I might imbibe a lot of folk life in my reporting trips to Ohio or Missouri or California or Florida, I don't write lots about folk life per se, although I do include some aspects of folk life in my stories. Like most newspaper reporters, I try to write news stories, newsy stories, and I try to capture the important trends affecting the nation's workers. Layoffs, plant closings, jobs moving overseas, stagnating wages, the need for worker retraining, how the constant corporate push to maximize profits hurts workers. And in structuring stories, I invariably feel a need to write about an important trend or two, and then tie in some workers' stories, some narratives to humanize those trends. I often feel it's vital to include the stories of workers, not just because those stories add some emotion, power, and color to my articles, but also to show how powerful trends often hurt how they affect America's workers. I think of a story I did this past June about the closing of a Whirlpool refrigerator factory in Evansville, Indiana. Evansville used to call itself the refrigerator factory of the world, refrigerator factory capital of the world. 1,100 workers lost their job when Whirlpool closed that factory. I remember proposing a story about the factory closing, and an editor said essentially, "What's new here? We've written lots about factory closings. Why should we bother writing about this one?" I persuaded him to give me a green light, saying this factory was an anchor of the city, and the closing represented much of what has been happening in the economy and to America's workers in recent years. In ways, I feel that I, as a newspaper reporter, also need to bear witness to what's happening to the nation's workers. So I'm going to read a few paragraphs from this story. Dateline, Evansville, Indiana. Having seen her father make a solid living at the Whirlpool refrigerator factory, Natalie Ford was enthusiastic about landing a job there and was happy years later when her 20-year-old son also went to work there. Generations, okay. But that family tradition will soon end because Whirlpool plans to close the plant on Friday and move the operation to Mexico, eliminating 1,100 jobs here. Many in the city in southern Indiana are seething and sad about losing what was long the city's economic centerpiece and a ticket to the middle class for one generation after another. This is all about corporate greed, said Ms. Ford, who took a job at Whirlpool 19 years ago. It's devastating to our family and to everyone in the plant. I wonder where we'll be 2 years or 4 years from now. There ain't any jobs here. How is this country going to survive? At a time when the nation's economy is struggling to gain momentum, Whirlpool's decision is an unwelcome step backward. It continues a trend in which the nation has lost nearly 6 million factory jobs over the past dozen years, representing 1 in 3 manufacturing jobs. Connie Brassel, who earned $18.44 an hour making thermal liners for the refrigerators, sees Whirlpool's move as a betrayal, not just of the workers, but also of the United States. Quote, "This country made Whirlpool what it is," she said. "They don't get world-class quality because they had the best managers. They got world-class quality because of the U.S. and because of their workers, and now they want to pack up and move to Mexico. I find it offensive." Whirlpool has operated the plant since 1956, and at the factory's peak in 1973, it employed nearly 10,000 workers. Ms. Brazel was hired 17 years ago after holding a string of minimum wage jobs, including as a cocktail waitress, but I didn't have space to mention that in my story. "I felt good about Whirlpool," she said. "I was becoming part of something bigger than me. Whirlpool was the best thing that ever happened to me. When she learned of the closing," she said, "I cried like a baby." I'm going to bore you with a few more paragraphs. The closing left not just Ms. Ford and her son without a job, but also her husband, a worker in the metal pressing shop. I quote Natalie Ford saying, "My mom and dad told me that when they were young, there were jobs everywhere. They said we had Whirlpool, Bristol-Myers, Mead Johnson, Windsor Plastics, Guardian Automotive, Zenith. Now if you want to find a job, there's nothing around." At age 43, Ms. Ford has little interest in returning to school, but if she can't find a job, she will rethink that reluctance. Maybe she'll become a physical therapist, she said. My first thought is to find work, but everything seems to be going overseas," she said. "If I go to school, it will be for something in the medical field because they're not going to ship that offshore, so I'll never have to go through this again." Her laid-off son is moving in with her. "I can't turn my kids away," she said. "I don't know how he'll survive." Sorry I went on for so long. So in a story like that, I really try to capture a lot of what's happening in the nation's economy. How workers are laid off, how they find themselves lost, how they find themselves directionless, how it affects several generations, how they are groping for their identity, how whole communities are trying to to figure out what they're going to do. And writing about the closing of the factory in Evansville, you could have written 5 or 10 or 15,000 words about it, but sometimes when you write a newspaper story, you feel like you're writing a haiku. I have to squeeze all this great material into 800, 1,000 words. I'd like to turn now to 2 broader subjects. First, how to write about workers and how to convey their stories. Second, I'd like to talk about work and transformation, how work in America has been changing. I pray that this doesn't sound self-important, but as labor and workplace correspondent for the New York Times, I feel that it is my responsibility to witness what is happening to the nation's workers, just as the reporter who covers poverty feels that way, or the reporter who covers healthcare feels it's important to bear witness to what's happening in those areas. And I feel this is all the more important because I am one of the few workplace reporters left in the nation. Yes, I sometimes feel like a dinosaur about to become extinct. I should note that the New York Times has some wonderful economics reporters who often write about workers as well. They write about workforce trends and the many ways America's workers are being squeezed. A lady in back asked about how to document long-term unemployment. We had a very good story, I think, last Friday about workers who've been unemployed for 27 weeks for a full year, and how the longer you've been out of work, the harder it becomes to find a job. And that story sort of tried to document that phenomenon. In my book, The Big Squeeze, I have a wise-ass line that for many years, the nation's news media have paid more attention to Paris Hilton than to all of the nation's 140 million workers put together. For years, the news media have paid attention to entrepreneurs, to Silicon Valley whiz kids, to billionaires, to Wall Street whiz kids, to financial engineers, but hardly any attention to the Jane and Joe's six-pack, or lunch pail, or the people who make the economy tick. And I felt it was important for me as a workplace reporter to help tell their stories. There are so many often horrible things happening to the nation's workers, being forced to work off the clock, being laid off by the thousands or tens of thousands, being paid half the minimum wage, being forced to work in wretched, dangerous conditions. There are so many horrible things that I think that it's vital to tell their stories, to get their stories out. Indeed, by far the main reason I started writing my book, The Big Squeeze, back in 2005, some 3 years before the recession began, was that I felt the nation's politicians, policymakers, and news media weren't paying nearly enough attention to the predicament that millions of workers faced. I felt that I could only scratch the surface in the 1,000 or 800-word stories I often write for the Times. I thought that only through a book could I paint the full picture of how factory towns were being decimated, about the way many managers no longer treated workers with basic dignity, about the flood of immigrant workers into the nation's workforce, and how wretchedly so many of those and how wretchedly so many of them are treated, about the way many long-term factory workers felt lost when their factories closed, and how they felt defeated and discombobulated when they ended up taking jobs at Toys R Us or Walmart. So I first met a Walmart worker, Verrett Richardson, in Kansas City when I was researching a story about Walmart workers being forced to work off the clock. And when Verrett Richardson opened up, and boy, that woman could talk, I learned so much from her. Here's a short excerpt. I went to speak to her about workers working off the clock, and she told me all this other incredible stuff. And I said, I got to use this someday, but I can't use it in my story on workers working off the clock. A few paragraphs. At first, Verrett adored working at Walmart. She liked the camaraderie, the atmosphere, talking to the cashiers and customers, but she slowly soured on it. Sometimes, she said, she was forced to work 10 straight hours without a break. The store was so understaffed, she said, that some days managers did not let her take her 30-minute lunch break or the 2 15-minute breaks that Walmart rules promised. One holiday season, the employees were so overstretched and the breaks so rare that the only way Verrett could grab lunch was to sneak into a changing room to wolf down a sandwich and chips. She said the managers were especially stingy about giving bathroom breaks. They'd, quote, they'd say, "What do you mean you need me to watch the register for you to go to the bathroom?" They'd say, "Why don't you just hold it in?" Verrett said. Quote, "There was one woman, she kept saying, 'I have to go to the bathroom, I have to go.' The woman menstruated on herself. Afterward, we had to wrap bags around her so she could get to the bathroom to clean herself up," unquote. Worried that her colleague would get in trouble, Verrett shut down her own cash register and rushed over to run her co-worker's register. To provide further help, Verrett asked another employee to run to get some sanitary napkins and a washcloth, which Verrett paid for herself. For this act of solidarity, Verrett got into trouble. Quote, "They said I was going to get written up because I left my register without permission." Fearing that she might someday face a similar emergency, Verrett started keeping spare underpants and a washcloth in her pocketbook. Several weeks later, a manager demanded that Verrett show him a Walmart receipt to prove that she had not stolen the underpants that were stuffed into her pocketbook. "I told them," Verrett said, "who's going to want this raggedy underwear from home?" So I discuss Verrett's case because, when you interview workers, you often say, well, I want to interview them about this issue, about being forced to work off the clock. And then you discover all this, when these people open up, you learn amazing stuff. And these people know things and have experienced things that I, and perhaps many of you, never experienced, never thought of. And I used Verrett, she was the lead person in this front page story I wrote about Walmart managers forcing people to work off the clock. But, when I set out to write the book, I said, God, I have all this other amazing stuff from Verrett that I need to use, that I want to use in the book because people don't know this type of stuff about what's going on. She told me this other story that I used in the book that, Verrett's African American. And she said, sometimes she and other workers would, stand up to management and say, this sucks, you shouldn't treat us that way. And management was scared to fire management often fires people who stand up to them, but they were very afraid to fire African Americans because then they were scared of being sued for racial discrimination. So when an African American spoke out and, pardon my French, pissed off management, they'd be put on the worst job on the worst shift. They'd be, and this happened to Verrett, she was put on a midnight job, the back-breaking job unloading trucks, and you basically force people to quit, which makes it very hard for them to sue you for firing them improperly. I know about constructive dismissal, but to me, one of the most wonderful yet frustrating things about being a reporter about writing about workplace matters is that I often do these amazing interviews with workers like Verrett Richardson, maybe for an hour, maybe for 2 hours. Sometimes the workers start to cry. Sometimes I too come close to tears. And then in my story, I might just have space for 3 or 4 paragraphs from these amazing interviews, and I find that very frustrating. That means when I take material from an interview, I try to distill it. I try to use the very, very best material, and to me that often means using quotations. I like to think, and perhaps I flatter myself, that I use very strong quotations from workers in my stories. I try to let them tell their stories, but unfortunately I often have only a limited number of words to do that. I often think of the interview I did with Drew Pooters, who spent 17 years in the U.S. Air Force before returning to work in the service sector at Toys R Us, Family Dollar, and Rentway. Drew Pooters, like Verrett Richardson, was an incredibly smart, quotable guy, and he philosophized at length during my interview about how poorly service sector companies treat their workers, and about how quick today's middle managers are to cut corners and flout the law, and about the declining social contract between America's employers and their employees. It was a treasure trove of an interview, and I felt keenly frustrated again about how little I could use in the newspaper article. Drew became the lead character in a big story I did about a practice known as shaving time, where managers go into the computer and erase hours that workers work. So if you had worked 47 hours in a week, whoops, they'd erase maybe 7 hours, so you worked 40 hours, so you wouldn't receive time and a half for overtime. And I had, again, this amazing interview with Drew Pooters, but in this story I was only able to use 4 or 5 paragraphs. And I write about him, as a former member of the Air Force Military Police, as a play-by-the-rules guy, Drew Pooters said he was stunned by what he found his manager doing in the Toys R Us store where he worked in Albuquerque. Inside a cramped office, he said, his manager was sitting at a computer and altering workers' time records, secretly deleting hours to cut their paychecks and fatten his store's bottom line. I told him that's not exactly legal, said Mr. Pooters, who ran the Toys R Us electronics department. Then he out and out threatened me not to talk about what I saw. Mr. Pooters quit, landing a job in 2002 managing a Family Dollar store, one of 5,100 in the discount chain. Top managers there ordered him not to let employees' total hours exceed a certain amount each week. And one day, he said, his district manager told him about a trick to cut payroll: delete some employee hours electronically. I told her, Miss Pooters recalled, I told her I'm not going to get involved in this. And when he refused, the district manager erased the hours herself. I know that many writers, including folklorists and documentarians, paint a portrait of workers by describing how they dress, by describing their hair and mustache, by describing the furniture in their living room or their kitchen, what the exterior of their house looks like, and how many pickup trucks they have outside their house. Pickup trucks, dead or alive. As a journalist who is usually limited to just 800 or 1,000 words, space constraints often make it very hard for me to sprinkle in colorful details like that. Sometimes such vivid color, such rich details seem forced or pretentious or out of place in an oh-so-serious story about trends such as the long-term unemployed or immigrant workers being exploited. Believe me, I wish I had the space in my stories to put in details like that, but I very rarely do. I'll tell you, it's very different writing about workers in a 1,000-word newspaper story from writing about them in a book. I remember that when I started writing the second chapter of my book, an 8,000-word chapter about a factory worker in upstate New York, I felt hugely liberated. I felt giddy. I felt as if I was flying through the stratosphere. For once I had the freedom I dreamed of to write at length, to make believe I was John Updike or John Steinbeck. For once I had plenty of paragraphs to describe what a worker looked like, to describe where she lived, to describe her background growing up on the wrong side of the tracks, to describe how the machine she operated, an injection molding machine, actually operated. When I interview workers, I try very, very hard to put them at ease, to get them to open up. That, of course, and Sarah Palin, I imagine, would say, I can never, as an elite Easterner, with several degrees, there's no way in the world, someone like me could ever get workers, to open up. But, it isn't that hard. Put people at ease, order some beers, and then, people talk. So it's, of course, easier to get people to open up when they're at home or in a luncheonette, in a diner, or in a bar, than during a 15-minute break in the factory or the retail store lunchroom. And as many of you know, it's also important to give workers lots of time to open up if you really want to hear their stories. You learn infinitely more in a 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour interview when people get to relax and let their hair down than in a 15-minute interview. When I wrote my book, I often felt that I was the voice of the workers, both as a microphone and as an amplifier for their stories, for their trials and tribulations. I felt that many of their stories weren't getting out there, and many workers have extremely powerful stories. And I allowed the many workers I interviewed to testify. I was happy to serve as the vehicle to disseminate, to spread what they were testifying about. In my newspaper stories, as well as my book, I usually feel it's vital to intersperse workers' stories, narratives about workers, with information on larger trends. I tried to make my book highly readable, and I sought to do that by combining many 2,500 or 3,000 word sections on trends, with lots of facts and economic statistics, with other, hopefully moving, humanizing, 2,500 word sections or narratives describing the work lives of some 24 workers. It's funny. Some critics of my book wrote that the factual and trend and economic statistics material was so compelling that they wished my book had fewer worker stories. But then another critic said that, that since I didn't know economics quite as well as Paul Krugman, I should have just stuck with those wonderful worker stories and left out the drier sections of economic analysis. Sounds like Papa Bear, Mama Bear. And I like to think that my mixture of worker stories and factual materials was just right. For instance, in my chapter on immigrant workers, I write about how the number of immigrant workers rose from 13 million to 21 million in a decade after 1994, and about how 6 or 7 million of them are undocumented workers, and about how many of those undocumented workers face hard conditions. But I believe that only by describing the plight of a few individual workers can you begin to convey how wretched things are. So I wrote about, in my book, I write about a Dominican immigrant, Julia Ortiz, who grew up on a coffee and banana plantation in the Dominican Republic in a fairly wealthy family. She dreamt of being a doctor, but as the 8th of 9th children, when she applied to college, her father said, sorry, I spent all my money educating your older siblings. You can't go to college, you can't become a doctor. So she eventually moved to the US in search of the American dream. And I try to write a good narrative about Julia's story. So a few paragraphs. After landing at JFK, Julia went straight to her Aunt Jacinta's apartment in Brooklyn, and her first impression was underwhelming. There was so much poverty, Julia said, but when she visited Manhattan a few days later, she felt far better about coming to America. She loved the excitement, the stores, the crowds, the skyscrapers. After a few weeks, her aunt told her that it was time to look for work. So Julia began crisscrossing Manhattan, inquiring about jobs at dozens of stores, delis, and restaurants, including some Taco Bells, all to no avail. She used to work at a Taco Bell in the Caribbean. Her aunt then took Julia to Broadway in Bushwick, a heavily immigrant neighborhood in Brooklyn. Broadway was chock-a-block with 99-cent stores, bodegas, check-cashing storefronts, Cucci Frito stands, cut-rate furniture stores, and Dunkin' Donuts. A store named Save Smart caught Julia's eyes. It sold furniture, kitchen appliances, and clothes. And once inside, her aunt asked whether the store was hiring. The manager said yes, and the next day Julia, having just turned 31, began working at the sales floor. I asked, Julia told me, how much are you going to pay me? The manager said, you work, and when I have time to pay you, I'll pay you, and you'll see how much, he said. He said, if I like the way you work after 3 months, I'll give you a raise. Julia joined a sales staff that was a mini United Nations. The workers came from Bangladesh, Colombia, India, the Ivory Coast, Jordan, Nigeria, and Venezuela. Of the store's 25 workers, Julia figured, 15 were illegal immigrants, a status that made them ripe for exploitation. Julia worked from 8:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. with a lunch break from 1:30 to 2, but no other breaks. That first week she worked 6 days, 66 hours. So when her supervisor paid her $210 in cash for the week, she was taken aback. And, quote, I at first thought the person who paid me was confused because it was so little, Julia said. I didn't want to say anything, though, because I was scared. Sometimes I felt like I was working for nothing, she said. Many days I had to walk all the way home, some 4 miles, because I couldn't afford the subway. Julia hated it when she was helping one customer and her boss suddenly screamed at her to rush over to another customer. Quote, some of the customers would come into the store and see how bad we were treated, Julia said, and would say to us, here, take this piece of paper. You should apply for a job at the place I mentioned on the paper. But Julia said she was afraid to look for another job because I didn't have papers. Besides, she felt the devil she knew was better than whatever other devils were out there. When her 2 children moved to New York from the Dominican Republic, Julia rejoiced, but her initial exuberance soon disappeared because she had dug herself into a deeper financial hole. Needing more room, Julia and Aunt Jacinto moved with the children into a dank 2-room basement apartment that they shared with one of Julia's brothers. Her daughter Raquel and Aunt Jacinto slept in one room while Julia, her son, and her brother slept in the other. The rent was $700 a month, nearly equal to Julia's monthly pay of $840 a month. Julia's dearth of money was matched by a dearth of time. Many evenings she returned from work at 9 at night. Her son Jesse would already be asleep, Raquel would be getting ready for bed, and Julia would have to abandon her intense desire to help them with their homework. Julia hardly saw her children on weekends because she had to work Saturdays and Sundays. When I was younger, Julia told me, when I first had my kids, I told myself, they're not going to be lacking for anything. They're going to have the best mother in the whole world. And I remember when I was interviewing Julia in her apartment, she burst into tears because she really had dreams of being, the world's best mother. And, her daughter, just 11 or 12 at the time, went over to comfort her mother. And I tried to capture that a little in my book. And, I first interviewed Julia Ortiz when I was writing about Knickerbocker Avenue in Brooklyn, and like half the stories on the stores on the avenue, failed to pay minimum wage, and she was one of 5 or 6 workers I interviewed. But I remember she had a remarkable story, and even though she was like 3 paragraphs in the story about this crazy street where where so many people were paid less than the minimum wage, I said, this woman has an extremely powerful story. So another digression, forgive me. Whenever I write about immigrants, I often think of Woody Guthrie's amazing song, Deportee, which is really one of my very, very favorite folk songs of all time. And I have the lyrics here, but I won't bother you with them. But now I'd like to discuss the transformation of work. Someone said I should discuss the transfiguration of work. All of you know about this subject. You all know about the never-ending plant closings and downsizings. You all know about the shift from manufacturing to service sector jobs. You all know about the rise of McJobs and Walmart jobs. You all know about the decline of the social contract. One other boring statistic I cite in my book, that in companies with over 100 workers, back in the 1980s, 84% of the workers in companies with more than 100 workers had good old pensions where from the day you retire to the day you die, you receive a monthly stipend. Now at companies with more than 100 workers, that's down to 33%. And in my view, that's one of the most powerful statistics about the decline of the social contract. Companies not wanting to pay for pensions are kind of shoving the risk of retirement, of financing retirement, to the worker. And that is all at the same time that wages have basically stagnated, so, you know, for the past 3 decades for the average worker. So I see other trends out there. The decline of solid middle-class jobs, jobs that paid $21, $23, or $25 an hour with good health care and benefits. Those jobs are being replaced increasingly by ones paying $12 or $14 an hour, often with no health care or pensions. A related trend is the upsurge in 2-tier wage systems. Those are highly depressing because of 2 things. First, a breach in solidarity in which current workers are willing to relegate new workers to lower wages and a lower standard of living. Second, this is a signal that many members of the younger generation will have things worse than their parents did. What does this mean for the American dream? It means in many ways we're going backwards. Kids will have it worse for their parents. You know, in the big squeeze, in my book, I describe how Caterpillar Tractor has adopted a 2-tier wage system at its plants in the US. I describe how young workers in the lower tier make $13 or $14 an hour, while working alongside workers in the top tier who do identical work but often make $25 an hour. That's a difference between earning $50,000, $52,000 a year, which in many Midwestern towns puts you solidly in the middle class, and earning $30,000 a year, where if you have a family, you can hardly scrape by on $30,000 a year. In Caterpillar's parlance, the lower pay scale is called a competitive wage, not so high that Caterpillar becomes uncompetitive against foreign tractor makers. But Inessa Wilcoxon, the wife of a Navy veteran who works on Caterpillar's lower pay tier, told me what she thought about competitive wages and how it was affecting her family. Inessa, whose father used to work at Caterpillar, said, "My parents' home was bigger. We always had 2 cars when I was growing up. When we went out to eat, we had a family of 5. When we went out to eat, we had a family of 5. We'd always go to a sit-down place. When we go out to eat now, it's McDonald's or Hardee's." The Wilcoxons, Inessa and her husband Scott, rent a rundown 3-bedroom house and have a second car only because Inessa's parents gave them their old GMC Sierra truck. This brings me to another big transformation that I'm seeing, the declining faith in the American dream. 25 years ago, yes, the era when it was morning in America, many Americans had strong confidence that they and their children would achieve the American dream. Remember what Natalie Ford said from Whirlpool, when the Whirlpool plant closed. "I don't know how, without any good paying jobs here in the US, how people are going to pay for their health care or put their kids through school." In my book, I have a chapter about Galesburg, Illinois, and the loss of a Maytag refrigerator factory plant there. Some of you are already asking, why do I write so much about refrigerator factories? It's because the shoe factories went abroad decades ago. The apparel factories went abroad decades ago. The toy factories went abroad decades ago. The TV factories maybe a decade ago. And now this decade, it's the bigger refrigerators, washing machines that are being made increasingly in Mexico and China. So there's a lot going on with refrigerator factories, unfortunately. And I write about Aaron Kemp, who was a star football player on the Galesburg High School football team. Once out of Galesburg, Aaron Kemp began working there at the Maytag plant on July 1st, 1996, starting in its metal stamping shop, where loud, ferocious machines banged and clanged the refrigerator sides and cabinets into shape. Having spent several years as a gas station monkey, Kemp was hankering for something with better pay, benefits, and job security. When relatives told him that Maytag was hiring, Kemp, 23 and already with a young daughter, hurried to apply. He reckoned that a factory that big, the largest employer in Knox County, one that made an essential appliance, would provide secure employment. Kemp told me it was a job where you could raise your family and have decent benefits, good health insurance, and a good pension, all the things that are important to us. A husky 5'10", he played offensive and defensive line for Galesburg High School's football team, but he shunned his parents' advice to go to college. Quote, "When I got out of high school, there were girls and parties and all the things that distract a young 18-year-old, he said. It was at the Maytag factory that he met his bride-to-be. Amanda Williams, earnest and hardworking like him, and together they had 2 boys. We were starting to really catch our stride, Kemp said. We could reach out and grab a piece of the American dream. We wouldn't be rich, but we'd be comfortable. The initial shock turned into anger when Maytag. So I described how one day he went to work and the managers announced that they were closing the plant. The initial shock turned into anger when Maytag's executives explained why they were closing the plant. They were farming out production of Maytag's lower cost, top mount refrigerators to Daewoo in South Korea, while they planned to produce Maytag's premier side-by-side refrigerators at a new factory in Reynosa, Mexico, just across the border from McAllen, Texas. There, management said, the Mexican workers would earn $2 an hour, compared with the standard pay of $15.14 an hour, $31,500 a year at the Galesburg factory. This is heartbreaking, Kemp said. This is one of the most unpatriotic, most un-American things I can imagine a company doing. They want Americans to buy their products, but they don't want to put Americans to work making those products. In the months after Maytag announced the closing, Kemp was sometimes brought to tears by the way his kids reacted. My daughter Alexandra would ask, "Why is Maytag firing all of you and your friends?" Kemp told me. My daughter would say, "Didn't you guys work hard enough? Didn't you do a good enough job making the refrigerators?" All those kid-type questions that are so hard to answer. Now and then, Kemp and his family drive past the huge Maytag plant, which sits lifeless, like a beached whale, with foot-tall weeds growing in cracks in the parking lot. To this day, Kemp said, whenever we drive by the Maytag facilities with our kids, they say, "There's Daddy's work." It hurts every time, he said. I could go on, but I'm too long about Aaron Kemp. Another huge transformation I've seen is the debasement of work and workers in America. I have this pet theory that back in World War II, the rich kid and the poor kid fought side by side in the trenches. And that created this solidarity, so that in the 1950s, when the rich kid was the manager or the owner of the factory and the poor kid was the blue-collar grunt, the rich kid who fought in the trench next to the poor kid, felt solidarity with him. Felt this person, he risked his life for our country. We owe him. We have to treat him well. And I think since the 50s and 60s and 70s, I think that was the kind of the golden era of the social contract of the establishment of the American middle class. But now that solidarity has really declined, and I believe that managers generally treat their workers, many managers treat many workers considerably worse than was the case decades ago. And one reason for that, I believe, is the growth of performance-based pay. When you tell a manager, the more you keep down your unit's payroll, the more you maximize profits in your unit, the higher your bonus. So that causes some managers to say, gee, I could increase my unit's profits, I can reduce payroll costs by forcing my workers to work off the clock, or by going into the computer and erasing hours that people work. And I think, in my World War II trench theory, there was real solidarity. People pulled together. And I think now many managers feel that their interests are, I want to use the word contradistinction, are clash with the interests of their workers. And then they really try to squeeze their workers much more than was the case decades ago. In truth, I'm often shocked by the way many managers treat their workers. I can't stand all the piffle from the many companies that boast of their Christian values, where their managers treat their workers like dog turd. Similarly, I know all these Orthodox Jews, and I read, lots of stories in the New York Times about, Orthodox contractors in Brooklyn and Queens, renovating houses, renovating commercial buildings, and it seems like every third week a scaffolding is collapsing, and a Hispanic worker dies. And I wonder, are these people truly religious? Whatever happened to the golden rule to treat others as you would want them to treat you? I'm preaching, I'm sorry. When I think of workers being treated without the respect they deserve. I often think of Drew Pooters, the Air Force veteran who described how managers blatantly showed contempt for him and other workers by erasing their hours at Toys R Us where he worked, and Family Dollar and Rentway. I was very moved when Drew Pooters told me this, and I quote him in my book this way: "I'm so disappointed with the retail world," he said. "They've broken every covenant with the American worker. I long for the days when you worked for a company and the company was loyal to you and you were loyal to the company." Then I interviewed a wonderful Mexican immigrant who worked at the Smithfield pork processing plant in Tar Heel, North Carolina, the largest hog killing plant in the world. His name was Alfonso. He didn't want me to use his last name. Alfonso said many Smithfield managers pushed their workers mercilessly, especially the Hispanics, sometimes ordering a team of 3 Hispanics to do what is normally done by 4 workers. Alfonso described the unrelenting pressure of the cutting room floor, where the workers hack and carve with a mindless fury, working just inches from each other with sharp knives, knives that in their constant rush sometimes slip and tear into the hand, the shoulder, even the face of a neighboring worker, and sometimes even into one's own arm or hand. On the loin line, Alfonso said, some workers couldn't keep up with the line speed, often causing chunks of meat to back up at their workstations, so much so that meat sometimes tumbled to the floor. At times, the loin line crew, working in 43-degree cold, had to rush so much to keep up that they did a bad job cutting the meat, and minutes later a supervisor would march over, throw the poorly cut meat at them, and start screaming. The line goes so fast that sometimes it feels like we're going to hell, Alfonso said. It makes you feel so bad you don't want to go back after your first break. You feel, oh, fuck. You're working in this terrible cold, but you're working so hard that you're sweating. Of the several dozen workers whose stories I tell in my book, the one I got to know by far the best was Kathy Sommier, an amazingly courageous woman from Syracuse, New York. She was the only worker to whom I devoted a whole chapter in the book. Her story told it all. Hers was the story of work and transformation, the story of the degradation of work, the story of employer contempt toward workers, the story of management doing anything and everything to keep out a union. Kathy worked at a factory that made plastic cups for yogurt and cottage cheese, a factory with 190 employees in which 4 of the 190 workers had fingers amputated over a 13-month period. It was a factory where the women filled 93% of the lowest rung, lowest paid, most dangerous jobs, the hectic, monotonous jobs, tending the molding machines and printing presses. At the same time, men held all but one of the 40 higher paying jobs. There were less stressful jobs servicing and fixing the machineries. The male technician jobs paid 50% more than the women's jobs. It was a plant where the men often asked the women for blowjobs during work and often slapped the women's asses. And when the women complained to management about the sexual harassment, management took a boys will be boys attitude, just saying, you know, forget about it. Kathy was the worker who stood up, the worker who filed a sex discrimination complaint with the EEOC, the worker who filed a complaint with OSHA about the amputations. She was the worker who led the unionization drive to join the United Steelworkers to give the workers a united voice to fight back. When I asked Kathy Sommier why she stuck her neck out and complained, she told me, I want dignity, I want respect, I don't want to be treated like a piece of dirt. I did it for the women in there. They're afraid to speak out. They're afraid of losing their jobs. Someone had to do something. One of her good friends and co-workers, Beverly Martin, told me, you're nothing but a mule in there. They feel if you don't like it, if you don't come back, they could always get another warm body. Because Kathy was so courageous, because Kathy Sommier spoke out, management took steps to get rid of her. First, they accused her of sabotaging a co-worker's car, and called in the police to interrogate her. Next, they moved her into what was really solitary confinement at the plant, working in a room all by herself for several weeks. Kathy told me, friends asked me, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just quit? I don't want the women there to be treated like a piece of dirt, Kathy said. I have a daughter who's growing up. I never want her to have to work in a place like this. Finally, management fired Kathy, accusing her of some ridiculous trumped-up charges that she had pulled down the pants of two men right there on the factory floor and fondled them improperly. I kept thinking, how low could management go? How low has the workplace been transformed? After Kathy was fired, the Steelworkers Union went to the National Labor Relations Board, accusing the company of firing her illegally, of retaliating against her illegally for supporting a union and for going to the EEOC and OSHA to complain. More than a year passed, and Kathy was finally reinstated by the NLRB and by a federal judge. Looking back at her ordeal, Kathy said, "I would do it all over again. The fight made me a lot stronger." I telescoped that story ridiculously. Kathy's an amazing woman. I think it's the role and the responsibility of journalists to write about the workplace, and folklorists and documentarians and many of us here to tell these stories, to tell the tale of what's happening to American workers, because with so few journalists still writing about the workplace, those stories aren't getting out there. And someone has to let the nation and the policymakers know, because far too often workers are invisible. Companies can give $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 to politicians and get meetings with politicians. Walmart's CEO can meet with politicians, but it's hard for the Walmart worker making $8 an hour to meet with a politician. So I fear that if we do not tell the story of what's happening to American workers, it will become that much easier for many of these unfair and unjust things to continue. I've gone on way too long, I apologize, but if you're not totally bored, I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
We have some microphones too. I think we have one back here.
So were you suggesting that maybe the fact that the wealthier kids didn't fight in Vietnam and Iraq and so on, that therefore there's the lack of solidarity?
You make a good point. I'm not saying that per se, but I think going back 40, 50, 60 years, rich kids and poorer kids did more together. Rich kids didn't quite as much go to private schools. They weren't quite the gated communities for the rich. They fought together in Korea. They fought together in World War II. In Vietnam, there was a draft in Vietnam. Some rich kids actually managed to fight there, but it was probably easier to get out than certainly World War II. But I do think there's much more. I just think there was more consideration, more solidarity, more togetherness, more pulling together as a nation in the post-World War II years than there is now. And we could, talk about this at length about why there's less now. But when we see, billionaires, hedge fund managers saying, it's so wrong for the Democrats, for Obama, to ask that they stop paying 15% as an income tax rate on the billions they earn from their hedge funds, and that is wrong to raise their tax rate to the same rate that many of us pay, 31%. I imagine a lot of rich people would not have been saying that 50 years ago. I'll just stop there.
Yes. I'm wondering why anybody is expecting jobs to come back. I mean, when people talk about jobs coming back, it reminds me of the cargo cults in New Guinea after World War II, where they built these imitation airports to try to attract these silver birds that brought all the treasures. With the changes in technology and the changes in globalization, why would anybody expect jobs to come back at all?
Again, we could discuss that for an hour. I think, part of me very much sympathizes with you, and I think one reason this recovery is so damn slow and jobs growth is so damn slow is that many companies are quietly still moving jobs to India and China, especially India. That's like, they laid off a lot of people when the recession started, and now as they ramp up, they're ramping up in India. And I think that's an untold story, and it's hard to get, but I think that's happening. That's one reason. You know, the economists will say the companies are sitting on $1.8 trillion in cash, and they're not investing it, they're not hiring because they don't see the demand out there. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. The companies will say, we're not investing because of that damned Obama and, and all these, regulations and all this uncertainty. And there's some truth to that, but I believe there's some exaggeration to that. But I think a big problem is there's not enough net demand. If Americans started buying a lot more GM cars or Chrysler cars or Ford cars, we'd see employment pick up in those fields. And maybe in some American tire factories, yes. On a certain level, I think Bernanke gets this, if you stimulate the economy enough and put all this money in circulation, that will create more demand, that will create more jobs. I mean, but it's slow. I think the ratio of the amount of money, you need probably more money, and companies need more profits now before they feel justified to create a job than was the case decades ago. I can't prove that, but that's my sense. Because, with globalization, they feel, we could build it in China, we can build it in Mexico, why build it here?
You mentioned briefly in a few cases about the unions. The fact that it's down to about, I think, 7% in private employment now, the union, could you talk about that briefly?
About the percentage of workers in unions dropping so low?
Yeah.
I could talk about that at length. I think the fact that, in the 1950s, the percentage of workers in unions was well over 35, and private sector workers in unions was well over 35%. So to go from that, when unions were a huge force in the economy, to 7% shows many things. It shows that companies have gotten much more expert in fighting unions. It shows that unions have gotten much less expert in knowing how to unionize workers. I think it also shows that the economy has changed. When you had these big factories with 10,000 workers, it was easier for everyone to get together to unionize. When you have smaller factories, now increasingly in the South, now increasingly using undocumented workers or single mothers who are very insecure, it becomes harder to unionize. And now the growth of the service sector, banks, insurance companies, hair salons, nail salons, Ann Taylor shops. I mean, these are places that would be very hard to unionize. And a lot of Americans, don't know much about unions, and a lot of them are hostile towards unions. A lot of people like unions, but a lot of people say, well, why should I join a union? Look what unions did to GM, Chrysler, and Ford. And I would imagine if I have great respect for the new president of the United Auto Workers, Bob King, but I would imagine if he's trying to organize workers at Toyota in Kentucky, they're going to say, what have you done for workers lately? Look at what happened to GM. You just agreed to this 2-tier contract where new workers at GM make $14 an hour, whereas the older workers make $26, $28 an hour. So I think, unions really have to do a lot of thinking about how they're going to turn things around before they slide into irrelevance in the private sector. The public sector, unions are much stronger, but they're having their, now is the time of crisis for public sector unions.
If not, I have, here's one. There's somebody behind the bill.
Just see if I can articulate it. I mean, I know as a journalist, a lot of the stories that you're writing, you're writing how larger events, globalization, corporatization, et cetera, are affecting workers. A lot of what folklorists or some documentarians would do, I guess, would be to, how do you reconcile looking at individuals' lives and workers and knowing that they have agency, that they can have a role in their life,
and what they do, as opposed to having everything just affect them. How do you portray, I mean, sometimes people would accuse folklorists of maybe even presenting, if anything, too rosy of a picture, or focusing on the individual worker or their experience of traditions without looking at this bigger context. I don't know, I'll just stop.
Thank you, Betsy. A few answers. So I have a chapter about companies that treat their workers very well. You know, Costco and the casino hotels of Las Vegas. And I write about a woman who is at Costco, you know, several layers of answer. A woman who works at Costco, and she used to work at a hip coffee bar in Seattle. And she said, you know, it was so much fun, but I got paid, you know, $9 an hour with no benefits. And I said, you know, finally I woke up and said, well, this is fun, but, you know, I got to become a grown-up. So she got a job at Costco, and you know, Costco, when you work there for 4 or 5 years as a cashier, you're making the equivalent of $43,000, $45,000, which is pretty good money. Plus, it has great benefits. So, I mean, there are, you know, workers can use their agency to better themselves, generally. But when there are 50 million workers without jobs, you know, one of the big problems we as journalists face and policymakers face and people who push for retraining face is they say, well, you're unemployed, go get some retraining, that will help you get a job. But if there are 5 job openings, no, sorry, if there are 5 unemployed workers for every job opening, you know, you could do all the retraining in the world, but there won't be the jobs to go around. But generally, if you're well educated, you know, in a specialized field, you know, the chances of you getting a job will be much more than if you're, you know, laid off factory worker who's 52 years old and aren't great in math, and your writing skills are you know, have been idle for a year. You know, so you know, I was doing Talk of the Nation for NPR last week, and there was a caller who said, my wife just got a doctorate in genetics from Berkeley, and she can't find a job. And I said, you know, that's just a freak. I mean, she'll find a job. I mean, sometimes you fall, but that defies logic. But, you know, then I was doing this story about retraining and going back to school, and I interviewed this terrific woman who had been, you know, she ran a production line at the Chrysler Jeep plant. You know, she ran about 200 workers. You know, she probably made $60,000 a year, and she got laid off. And she went back to a community college. You know, this is agency at work. You know, she went back to community college. She took like a 6-week program to become, you know, a nursing assistant, right? You know, emptying bedpans. You know, tending people, you know, when they're sick. She's making $12 an hour, and she said she loves the job. I said, why do you love the job? She said, you know, it's much more interesting than running a assembly line. I meet with people, I really help them, and you know, with this job, I'm going to be able to study to become a nurse. And so I'm going to go from, you know, $12 an hour, $25,000 a year, to becoming a nurse who will make $50,000. And then she said, once I become a nurse, I'm going to get a master's degree in nursing, and I'm going to become, you know, a nursing supervisor, and I'll be making even more than I made at Chrysler. So, like, that's a nice story. And this woman has her stuff together. And you meet out there, you meet a lot of people who have their stuff together, and they're just, they fall down and they're getting back up again. But you also meet some people who sort of have their stuff together too. You know, how many people do I meet who say, I'm going to train to become a truck driver? You know, laid off factory workers, I'm going to train to become a truck driver, and they just aren't all the truck jobs. I mean, that's a logical choice for a lot of them, but there just aren't all the jobs. So a lot of people try and luckily, you know, find the route that takes them to greener pastures, and a lot also try, and at the end of that rainbow, there's nothing for them yet, and unemployment's very high, and let's just pray it goes down, fast and soon. I don't know if that. I hope that answers your question, Betsy. So.
Thank you, Steve. I think listening to your presentation today and reading your book, I couldn't help but think that, you know, the American Folklife Center has these collections. You know, we build collections of people who do oral histories. So maybe you can be thinking about the American Folklife Center down the road. I know the New York Times has their role with collections, but you know.
Let me bore you with another answer or two. So I got a note from a very nice editor at the New York Times, Nancy Kenny, who broke her wrist and she's having a hard time working, typing, and she was at her orthopedist, and the orthopedist said to her, "Why doesn't someone write a sequel to Studs Terkel's Working?" And Nancy wrote to me literally Friday night and said, "Steve, you're the guy, you should do that." And I said, you know, Working is an extraordinary book, and to really find 150 great people to interview takes a long time, right? I mean, you probably need 500 people to interview. And I don't have a radio show where I could just sit down and interview people. And then I wonder, you know, and this is how the nation has changed. Will Americans be willing to, if there was a great version of Working nowadays, you know, with updated, you know, 3-page interviews of 150 workers or 200 workers, would Americans want to read that book nowadays? I don't know. I wish I would agree, but I'm not sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Think about that. You know, it's a great. It's a great idea.
If you could get it into, you know, 140 characters and tweet and Twitter.
Please join me in thanking Steve Greenhouse once again for his presentation.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.